Wave Sound Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of Kookaburra Cottage by Maya Linnell, narrated by Casey Withers. One. The winery car park was swirling with rubbish when April Lacey pulled up on a blustery summer's day, and she groaned, wondering how many early morning tourists had driven into Lacewing Estate, taken one look around the tired, litter-strewn entrance, and headed straight back out. Tugging on the handbrake, she jumped down from her Hilux ute and reinstated the fallen sandwich board before chasing after the wind-blown litter. A gust of Terra Rossa soil followed April inside, settling on the polished concrete floor. "What a gale," said Fran Lacey, emerging from the barrel room. "Strong enough to blow the milk from a teacup. Thought you'd be halfway to Adelaide by now." Fran plucked a navy and orange brochure from the pile April had brought in, casting an appraising eye over the gold embossing and thick card. Even covered in dust, next door's brochures looked expensive. "I should be," April said, but the builder had a cancellation. "By the way, I found the yard plastered with Winklin Wines promotions. I'll send them home with Archie when he comes over next week." Fran glanced out the window to the neighbouring vineyard. "That little boy needs friends his own age, just like a certain someone else I know. A 10-year-old should be surrounded by nose-picking, bug-hunting, troublemaking little boys, not someone almost 2 decades his senior." April shook her head with a grin and kissed her stepmother on the cheek. "Love you too, Franny." "Good luck with the builder," Fran called, dusting the wine bottles. "And make sure you lock your doors when you hit Glen Osmond Road. More carjackings on the news last week." April waved goodbye and stepped back out into the warm morning. She walked towards the dilapidated stables in the middle of the Shiraz and Chardonnay vines, just a few hundred metres from her home. A Commodore ute towing a trailer was parked alongside the stone building, and when she got closer, April saw the builder was still sitting in the car, phone to his ear. Tradesmen were thin on the ground in the rural South Australian town of Penwarra, and she was grateful the builder had called her when he'd had a cancellation, even if it meant a later departure for the city. "It'll be well worth it," she told herself, waving off the builder's apologetic, be-there-in-a-minute gesture. April checked her own phone, wondering where Justin was. There had been no reply to her message this morning. Another winemaking dilemma? Or maybe he'd assumed this builder would take one look at the old stables before laughing in her face, like the last tradesman she'd requested a quote from. Shrugging off the memory, she pulled open the double doors. The hinges shuddered under the weight of the aged oak, and April's eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim space. Although it had been decades since the last tenants lived there, the earthy aromas of the Clydesdales that had carted grapes from the vineyard to the winery still lingered in the air, along with a faint hint of straw and the rich leathery smell of saddlery. These days, the stables were a jumble of stored clutter. Not for long, thought April. Dust from the rough-and-ready paddock rock walls rained down on her navy linen dress. Not bothering to brush it off, April reached for the light switch, then turned when a low whistle came from behind her. The builder crossed his arms, his experienced eye assessing the structure. "You know it'll be cheaper to build something completely new rather than renovating this old hut, right?" "Have you been talking to my boyfriend?" April laughed. Given the small town and the many links between the nearby communities, it wasn't out of the question. The builder shook his head. "Just telling it how it is," he said, before introducing himself as Gordon Whitty. "A small space like this might seem easy, but working with materials this old..." He trailed off, noticing the hopeful look on her face. "I'm not saying it can't be done, but even if you're keen to help out, it won't be a cheap exercise." Not a screaming endorsement, but not a flat-out refusal either. Looking around at the dirt floor, dilapidated roof and cobwebs, April felt a thrill of excitement. Despite the challenges, she knew these old stables could be the bed and breakfast she'd always envisaged. Gordon pulled a metal ruler from his pocket and gently scratched at the mortar holding the stones together. The lime and sand mix yielded easily, sending a sprinkling of grit to the ground. Truth be told, I'm surprised the council and heritage team approved it. You'll want a structural report, an energy assessment, a new floor, and depending on the quality of those timbers, the whole roof might need replacing. And that's before you can even start working on an ensuite or that loft you mentioned. He continued to rattle off the jobs one by one until he'd run out of fingers. I've already got the plans drawn up and those things taken care of, said April, unable to keep the enthusiasm from her voice. The paperwork side of it was pretty lengthy, but I've been saving and planning this for years. I've just got to find someone brave enough to take it on. Or crazy enough, came a droll laugh from outside. April looked over the builder's shoulder to see Justin McGill in the doorway, his hair like a cockatoo's crest in the wind, dimples flashing, and a smile that softened his words. The breeze picked up, and a small cloud of dust seeped through the crumbling mortar line in what April hoped would become the mezzanine bedroom. There you are, she introduced the builder to her boyfriend. Hopefully Gordon here sees it as a challenge, not a folly. The builder looked between them, perhaps noticing the way she said folly, and held up his hands. None of my business either way. If you're willing to pay for the work, I think I can shuffle it in between a few other projects. April beamed as Gordon quizzed her about the project and discussed the timeline. She had barely let herself hope they'd find a builder willing to give the old building a chance. 10 minutes later, when Gordon had left and April had kissed Justin goodbye, she pulled onto the Riddick Highway and set the cruise control to 110 kilometres per hour. Although it was still early, heat was already shimmering off the asphalt. She'd only just got up to speed when her father's number appeared on the touchscreen display. I've already locked my doors, Dad, she said, preempting a repeat of Fran's warning. Lloyd Lacey chuckled. From the sound of the wind whistling against the phone, she guessed he was outside, assessing his grapes. Righto, said Lloyd. Keep your hair on. We're only looking out for you, you know. Fran said you finally had a builder turn up. No wonder Justin was late. Is the builder any good? April let the comment about Justin pass, knowing it wasn't wise to add more fuel to that particular fire, not with vintage looming and the hot summer creating an extra level of stress for the winery staff. Gordon seems great, Dad, April said, checking her rearview mirror. She cranked the air conditioner a little higher. With a bit of luck, we'll have the bed and breakfast ready for the first guests in spring. Leafy green vines whizzed past on either side as April drove out of Penwarra and allowed herself the pleasure of imagining her bed and breakfast in its finished state, with striped curtains fluttering in the windows, flowers on the dining table, sumptuous French linen on the bed, and glowing reviews from honeymooners whose married lives had started at the converted stables in the vines. It was only when the Adelaide skyline came into view that she wondered why her father had told her that Justin was late. Wasn't he up to his eyeballs in winery stuff, with her dad? Where had he been this morning if not at the winery? She shook the thought away, blaming the heat and the ad hoc appointment with Gordon for the misunderstanding. Connor Jameson rummaged around in his suitcase for his sunglasses. They had never seen the light of day in England, but were now an essential frontline defence against the dazzling Australian sunshine. He smoothed down his white blonde hair in the hotel's bathroom mirror, tucked a paper map into his back pocket, and stowed his sunnies inside his suit jacket, right next to his wallet. He was about to shut down his laptop so he could lock it in the safe when the Zoom ringtone sounded. Connor accepted the call, and his sister Heidi appeared on the screen. Even with jet lag, you scrub up well. Her incredulous tone made him grin. She'd seen him decked out in his finest for concerts, weddings, and funerals umpteen times before. And that sunshine streaming in through your window. Her breath fogged the air. I'd sell a kidney just for a fraction of it. I've barely defrosted, he replied. Though with this Aussie weather it shouldn't take long, he said, eyeing the knitted cap pulled low over Heidi's brows, her red fingerless gloves and the bright woolen scarf wrapped around her neck. Is it snowing at home yet? Heidi shook her head. Trying to. All we've seen so far is sleet. Enough about our miserable British weather, though. How was your fancy event? Meet your new boss yet? Connor shook his head, glancing at the hotel's digital alarm clock. It's tonight. I'm just heading off now. The rest of the winemakers are meeting for drinks beforehand. Bit of Dutch courage before we stride into a room full of Australian icons. They're no better than any of you lot, said Heidi, her eyes flashing. He wasn't sure if it was from sisterly pride or simply because she was patriotic, but it was touching all the same. You might end up teaching them a thing or two about vineyards and vintages. That's not quite how this program works, Connor reminded her. We're here to learn from the experts. A knock sounded on his door and Connor stood. Have a great night, Con, and make sure you call Mum and Dad when you get back tonight. They're itching for updates. They still worry, you know. Connor brushed off her concern with a quick farewell. He knew she meant well, all his family did. But ever since the accident, their concern had at times felt suffocating. The knock came again, along with a cheerful hurry up. Come on, lads, adventure awaits. Recognising the Scottish brogue of Fergus, one of the winemakers who'd caught the same flight from Manchester, Connor stowed his laptop in the safe and stepped out to meet him. The conference venue wasn't far from the hotel, and the sunshine was warm enough that most of the young winemakers, who'd travelled from the Northern Hemisphere winter just days earlier, carried their suit jackets over their forearms. This is when the fun starts, Fergus said, looking left and right at all the people, as if he were entering a ballroom of royalty instead of a conference room full of the nation's top winemakers. Anticipation bubbled in Connor's stomach. He'd applied to be part of this international program several times over the years, and now that he was finally here, he was both nervous and exhilarated. But would it be the fresh beginning he'd been so desperate for? When the waiter sashayed past with a tray of champagne flutes, April grabbed 2 glasses, quickly downing the first as she surveyed the conference room. Yesterday had been a long day, with the 4-hour drive to Adelaide blowing out to over 5 hours thanks to roadworks in the Tailem Bend and an accident requiring a detour through Murray Bridge. She'd missed the first workshop, but made up for yesterday's late start by arriving early this morning and sitting up the front of each session, taking notes and photographing the most pertinent presentation slides. Setting her empty glass down on a wine barrel, April picked up a program, scanning the information about the International Winemakers Exchange. As if on cue, a group of newcomers emerged through the big double doors on the far side of the room. Even if one of them hadn't been wearing a kilt, she would have known immediately they were the international newbies. They moved as a pack towards the wine bar, and one of them pulled a phone out and snapped a selfie beside the distinctive kangaroo logo on the banners for the Destination SA program. The program was synonymous with the food and wine tourism industry, and a key reason April had chosen to attend the city function. They look happy to be here, don't they? She turned at the sound of an amused voice, surprised to discover that while she'd been watching the new arrivals, someone had been watching her. A lady with an off-the-shoulder gown nodded in the direction of the bar. I always like seeing fresh faces in the industry. And this program with the UK winemakers and viticulturalists is a win for everyone. Don't you think? April recognised the woman instantly. How's this for good luck? She marvelled, introducing herself to Stephanie Scowler. I've just finished your audiobook on winery marketing, April said, trying not to gush. It felt like you were talking directly to me the whole drive to Adelaide yesterday. If I hadn't been running late, I would have pulled over several times to take notes. No wonder it won you so many awards. Stephanie inclined her head modestly, though she was clearly pleased, and fixed April with a broad smile. Glad you got so much out of it. After all those years in the industry, I wanted to help others wade through the marketing and branding jungle without bankrupting their wineries. It's a tough market for small wineries. Every employee wears multiple hats. Every dollar counts. You're not wrong there. Grateful for the low lighting inside the conference room, April toyed with a loose thread on her pink lace dress. It had looked so elegant in the Penwara charity shop mannequin, but on closer inspection it had a few faults in the lacework. Then added brightly, I hope you've brought boxes of books with you. I'm sure there will be a queue at the signing table after your keynote speech. She didn't mention that Stephanie's name on the conference program, along with the Destination SA workshop, had sealed the deal for April's city trip. I've booked a one-on-one session with you tonight. April rummaged in her handbag, grabbed a business card and passed it to Stephanie. Like her dress, the business card was a little tired around the edges. Hopefully you can steer me in the right direction for grants and marketing opportunities. I'd love to get involved in the Destination SA program, but I don't even know where to start. Stephanie stowed the business card in her leather purse with a nod. That's what I'm here for, she said. That food tourism program has been the making of so many of my clients. Once you're on their books, you'll see a huge upswing in visitors and promotion. If you want to chat leadership opportunities and rebranding, we can look at that too. Loads of potential for keen young winemakers and vitties looking to make their mark on the industry. Tell me, have you applied for the Young Wine Leaders Award? April looked up from under her fringe, feeling suddenly shy. On paper, she was probably the perfect fit for the Young Wine Leaders Award. She just scraped into the under 30 age bracket, and she was from a winemaking family. April drained her second glass of bubbly, searching for an explanation that didn't sound like a cop-out. I'm just a horticulturalist, not a winemaker. My folks run a small winery and I mostly work off-farm, but I'm hoping to open a little B&B on the property, and I've got some great ideas in the pipeline. April trailed off, wishing she hadn't mentioned the Destination SA program. There was so much to do before they could even think about applying, and she didn't have a firm plan in place yet. Justin's right. I shouldn't try to run before I can even walk. April ran a hand over her wavy hair and deflected Stephanie's attention back to the group of newcomers. I wonder how many of those international crew are coming down to the Limestone Coast. We're always struggling for workers in our region. Stephanie picked up her glass of wine and gestured towards the bar. Let's go find out. The buzzing room, the enthusiasm of his fellow expats, and the free-flowing wine were the perfect ingredients for a good night. The minute the formalities were over, Connor's new friends grabbed their jackets and handbags. We've paid our dues for the evening, waddled onto that stage like a bunch of penguins and made small talk with the obnob sponsoring the programme, said Fergus, rising from his chair so fast his kilt nearly flicked up. Let's cut loose. Connor looked around the function room, then back at the programme. According to the last week's email, I think we're supposed to stay in network. Fergus grinned, tucking his scruffy ginger hair behind his ears. You're off to Rossvale in a few days. I'm heading to a winery 4 hours south of here, and the rest of the group will be scattered across the state. We'll have more fun making our own after-party, don't you think? Hindley Street beckons. Connor laughed. He'd read enough TripAdvisor reviews to know Hindley Street was where you went if you were looking for trouble. I think I'll stick around, he said, scanning the room. Apparently there's a marketing and tourism team here, offering free mini consultations after the event. Suit yourself, Fergus shrugged. I'm off the clock for the night. Catch us up later when you're done brown-nosing. He jogged off to join the rest of the group, leaving Connor alone at the table. Connor pulled out the conference timetable, reread the spiel that had caught his eye earlier, and went in search of the team from Destination SA. If their collaborations between small wineries, catering teams, and corporate clients were as successful as their website promised, he wanted to find out more. He headed towards a group of people carrying clipboards and pens. Connor couldn't see a formal line, but a petite, dark-haired woman in a pink dress was deep in discussion with the clipboard-wielding officials, so he hung back, letting the Australian accents in the room wash over him. Connor's ears pricked up as he eavesdropped on her conversation. He gathered she was keen on boutique accommodation. Smart, he thought. The Kiwi winery he'd worked for had diversified with luxury guest houses and glamping tents to great success. A waitress walked past slowly, her eyes darting down at her tray as if she were holding a live grenade. Connor wasn't sure if it was her braids or her frown of concentration, but she reminded him of his littlest sister, Pippin. And even though he wasn't particularly thirsty, Connor held up his hand. I'll grab a water, please, he said. She looked at him gratefully. The quicker I get rid of this load, the better. It's only dumb luck I haven't dropped a tray already. First night waitressing? She nodded, then gasped as the glasses wobbled. It gets easier, Connor said, giving her an encouraging smile. Just make sure you keep the tray balanced. Connor turned to see the conversation wrapping up in front of him. That's great. I really appreciate your help, the pretty brunette said, shaking their hands. Connor caught his breath when she turned her sunny smile on him. Her eyes were almost hidden beneath a dark, heavy fringe, but he could see they were sparkling with excitement. Sorry to hold up the queue. My appointment evaporated into thin air. So many good ideas. Connor smiled back at her, noticing how her rose-coloured lipstick matched her dress. Don't rush off on my behalf. They'll probably start charging me if I stay any longer, she whispered with a grin. And I've studied their website enough to know they're well out of my budget. Mind you, I'm not above loitering and eavesdropping on the other conversations. Too cheeky, do you think? He admired her pluck. May as well make the most of the opportunity. Connor was just stepping across to introduce himself when an unmistakable tinkling of glass and then a string of swear words came from behind them. He turned to see a tumble of glasses smashing on impact, the young waitress looking ashen, and a red-faced bloke with wine dripping down his trouser leg. Connor started towards them, followed by the brunette he'd been speaking with. What a mess, Connor said. That poor waitress. Of course it had to be Dan. He's got 2 left feet and the worst butterfingers in the district, the woman said. You know him? She nodded. My neighbour, Daniel Winklin. Connor took his jacket off and, averting his eyes, handed it to the panicked waitress. You might need this, he said gently. The young lady looked down, shocked to see her white shirt was drenched. She clutched his jacket to her chest. He knocked the tray. I swear it wasn't my fault, she said, tears carrying the mascara down her cheeks in murky black streaks. Connor shook his head. You won't be the last person to drop a tray of glasses, trust me. A steady stream of business cards fluttered from his jacket pocket, landing in the puddle of wine. Oh, look, now I've gone and wrecked your things too, the waitress sobbed, fishing out a soggy business card. I can't get anything right. It's fine. Connor kneeled down and began collecting the largest shards of glass. They're out of date anyway. My UK phone number won't work out here. I'd forgotten they were in there. You teach music? Connor looked up to see the brunette in the pink dress examining a dripping card. With the cute dress, broad accent and dark eyes that crinkled with happiness, she was a sight to behold. I teach piano, but only when I'm not making wine, he said, glancing away. If all Australian women were this attractive, he was going to be in deep trouble. 2. April had always known Dan Winklin was clumsy. Growing up together, their teachers had kept boxes of Band-Aids in their top drawers especially for him. But after his outburst drew the attention of everyone in the room, she could tell he'd had a little too much to drink. As far as she could see, the pair of them were the only Limestone Coast representatives there. And while Winklin Wines might have enough money to weather a bit of bad press, Lacewing Estate didn't have that luxury. After the worst of the broken glass had been cleared up, she gently pulled her friend and neighbour aside. Can't take you anywhere, Winklin, she said, looking over his shoulder. The British chap was reassuring the young waitress, and other staff had arrived with buckets and mops. What's going on? Daniel wasn't much taller than April's 5'3", and he was only a month or so older, but his shoulders sank at her question, making him seem even shorter and more world-weary than his 29 years. Andre dumped me. Even though Daniel's head was lowered, April noticed he was fighting back tears. She rubbed his arm awkwardly, not sure where to start. While Daniel had doted on the French winemaker from the moment he arrived in town, she'd never warmed to Andre's haughty arrogance. I thought you guys were patching things up. I thought so too, Daniel sighed, but apparently our versions of fidelity are quite different. He was packing his bags to leave when I woke up this morning, starting a new life in Tassie with his new lover, apparently. April winced, ready to suggest taking the conversation to a quiet corner, when he straightened up and hailed a passing waiter. Which is the perfect reason to get rollicking drunk, I say. Better than sitting at home crying into my teacup. He scooped 2 glasses from the waiter, keeping hold of them both. What about you? Tell me about your accommodation project. Any progress? April updated him on her meeting with the builder. I've had a couple of great sessions on marketing pillars and wine tourism today too, she added. So, with a bit of luck, the bulk of the building work will be finished by late winter, a marketing plan will be firmed up in the next few months, and we'll be taking bookings for late spring, early summer. Daniel raised an eyebrow. And does the charming Justin still think it's a folly? Tell me you're not going to be the one baking fresh bread and making picnic baskets for your guests. Unlike Justin, cooking wasn't April's strong suit, and Daniel knew it. I don't want to give anyone food poisoning. Of course he's on board. I'll do the gardens, and once he's finished the vintage, he'll magic up a menu of hampers using local produce. It'll be great. April remembered the Winklin Wines brochures cartwheeling through the car park. Which reminds me, I rescued a bunch of your new flyers from the wind yesterday. They look really great, really sharp. Oh, those, said Daniel, dabbing at a Cabernet-coloured stain on his shirt. There's a typo on the second page, just toss them straight in the bin. Dad nearly had a coronary when he heard I'd signed off on the proofs with a single S in dessert wine. Daniel gave a sheepish shrug. What's a few grand in the scheme of things, right? A few grand? April wished she had that type of money to burn. The handsome Brit stepped in beside her, and when she caught his eye, she sensed he was also holding his tongue. Even converted to euros, the printing slip-up would probably fund a cross-hemisphere airfare. Dan Winklin, Winklin Wines. Daniel stretched out a hand to introduce himself. Connor Jameson. April introduced herself too, warming to his quiet confidence and enthusiasm to learn from Australian wineries. I've heard of Penwara. Best Shiraz in the state, yeah? Connor said. Daniel visibly pulled himself together, his maudlin musings about his breakup forgotten as he bombarded Connor with facts and figures about the grape varieties they grew, aging periods, and workforce issues. Connor stood between them, quietly sipping his wine and nodding in the right moments while Daniel rabbited on. April heard one of Fran's sayings in her ears, unbidden. Handsome is as handsome does. An apricot gown drifted through her peripheral vision, prompting April to remember why she was there and stop her imagination from wandering. I've just got to catch someone, she said, shooting Daniel and Connor an apologetic look. Even though she'd already suspected Andre the French winemaker was a cheating scoundrel, she'd be able to give Daniel her full attention and sympathy when they were home. She turned and headed in pursuit of Stephanie Scowler. There hadn't been time to chat for long after Stephanie's keynote speech, not with so many fans also queuing to get their books signed. But this wine tourism and marketing conference only came around once a year, and she needed to make the most of this opportunity, for Lacewing Estate, as well as her new bed and breakfast. April picked up her pace. Connor pocketed the Winklin Wines business card, wished Daniel all the best, and made his way through the crowd and outside. He saw April sitting on a bench by the entrance and made his way over. He wasn't sure what she'd hoped to glean from the conference, but he found himself hoping it had been worthwhile for her. Did you catch the person you were after? April lifted a shoulder in a shrug. She had checked out for the night. I should have made my move earlier. Then, to add insult to injury, the team offering free wine-related marketing advice waltzed out with their clipboards and banners, just when I'd thought up a dozen more marketing questions. She sighed, leaning her elbows on her knees, then resting her chin on her hands. I don't think they were planning on doing overtime tonight, Connor said gently, taking a seat beside her. The minute the clock struck 11, they capped their pens and headed for the hills. She twisted to meet his gaze, and along with a, I know you're trying to cheer me up, look, there was something else, too. Can I buy you a drink? I'm no expert on B&Bs, but I can share what I've seen in the UK, New Zealand and French wineries I've worked at. I've just ordered a taxi, she said, straightening up again. As much as she tried to hide it, The flash of reluctance in her eyes indicated she was momentarily torn between calling it a night and changing tack in pursuit of marketing tidbits. Nightclubbing? I hear Adelaide's pumping on a Friday night. You're welcome to it, she said with a smirk. I'd rather drink a case of cheap white wine than set foot in one of those sleazy sweat factories. What? Connor acted shocked. How can you not love bad music, body odor, and cheesy pickup lines? Though it does depend on the wine, I suppose. How cheap are we talking? Their conversation moved from the worst wine they'd tasted to the sleaziest nightclubs they'd visited, and Connor found himself laughing as she described a dive from her uni days. It was the first time he'd felt a spark since Phoebe. Connor pushed away the thought, not wanting the past to cloud the present. He snuck another look at April, trying to get a better read on her, when the phone lit up in her hand. And just like that, a mask fell over her face. Anyway, I've got an early start tomorrow morning. Dozens of people milled around, waiting for Ubers and taxis. You might be waiting a while, he said. Which direction's your hotel in? It's a nice night for a walk-in. April quickly shook her head, her gaze darting down the well-lit street. Have you read the front page of the Advertiser recently? Walking around the city at night is not for the faint-hearted. He laughed. What would she make of the London crime stats? The stories his sister Heidi shared from her shifts on the beat were full of opportunistic crimes. Don't let me hold you up, though, April added. I'm happy to wait. The taxi shouldn't be too far away. As she lifted her phone, he spotted a photo of a shaggy golden retriever grinning at the camera. Connor uncrossed his legs and leaned across to get a better look at the phone screen. I'm in no hurry. Nice dog. Retriever. She turned, her hair tickling his cheek, and her warm eyes crinkling at the sides as she nodded. Mishka's our winery mascot and chief troublemaker. April enlarged a photo of the dog lounging on a timber deck beside a fire pit, with fairy lights and fruit-laden vines dangling from a pergola. Thinks she's the lady of the manor. We had a retriever when I was a kid, Connor said, smiling as he remembered the placid pooch. Duke was soft as butter, and he was gentle and loyal, and didn't mind when my sisters dressed him up in ridiculous Halloween outfits. Duke? As in Marmaduke? As in Duke Ellington, he clarified. The jazz player, April finished, giving him an appraising look. That's right, you're a piano guy. He sensed he'd just jumped a few bars in her estimation, and although he couldn't take credit for his musical family, he was happy to see her guard drop a little. I'm more of a Nina Simone and Billie Holiday fan myself, but I don't mind a little Duke. Louis Armstrong and Charlie Parker are on my playlist every now and then too. So which region are you destined for? Barossa, Clare, McLaren Vale? Connor gave her the name of the Ross Vale Winery, one of the most prestigious in the state. I've heard stories about their chief winemaker. Wait till you see this, she said, rifling through her phone's photo library. Now where did I save it? April held up her phone for both of them to see as she scrolled, and he caught a whiff of sweet, musky perfume. Between the screenshots of website pages, close-ups of grapes and panoramic vineyard shots, there were dozens of photos of her dog, and more than a few of vegetables. A market gardener, perhaps. He wanted to ask her about her vegetables, to see if they were a profession or a passion, but the moment disappeared when he saw a photo of her hanging off another bloke's arm. Although there was no ring on her finger, the photo explained her reluctance to go out for drinks. She found the image she was after and enlarged it. One of my uni mates snapped this photo last vintage. The winemaker, Johan Riverton, rolls out a swag in the middle of the vineyards and sleeps there when they're waiting on ripening, April said, chuckling. He sets his alarm hourly so he knows the moment the grapes are ready to harvest. I'd heard he was a hard taskmaster, but Connor gave a low whistle. Still, if camping out in the vineyard was what it took to make award-winning wines, he was prepared to give it a go. Well, I guess I didn't come all the way to Australia to twiddle me thumbs. April put her phone away as a convoy of taxis pulled up outside the conference centre. He looked at his watch, surprised to see it was past midnight already. It had been a long time since he'd lost an hour talking about dogs and wineries and jazz, and even though he now suspected she was off limits, he was still disappointed. "I think that's mine," April said, pointing as a taxi with distinctive branding pulled in. "Thanks for keeping me company. It was nice getting to know you, Connor Jameson." Connor opened the cab door and bade her farewell, but before he could close it, he heard his and April's name being called. Spinning on his heel, Connor saw Daniel Winklin, the drunk chap from earlier, waving from the top of the stairs. "Dan?" April scrambled out of the cab. "Hold a taxi a minute, please." They made it to the bottom of the stairs just as Daniel lost his balance and pitched forwards, stumbling down a few steps before finally catching the metal handrail. They let out a collective breath, but from Daniel's moan it was clear he'd hurt something on his way down. Connor's left leg had been aching all night, and he discreetly flexed his foot to ward off cramping before crouching by Daniel's side. "All right, Cobber." "No wonder Andre left me. I can't even get down a flight of stairs without making a scene," Daniel spluttered. "He's sozzled," April said, shaking her head and patting down her neighbour's pockets until she found a wallet. Connor couldn't help noticing the yellow banknotes in the wallet, confirming his initial thoughts. Dan Winklin wasn't short of coin. April pulled out a hotel key and with a bit of prompting confirmed the hotel Daniel was booked into. It took a few attempts, but eventually they managed to hoist him down the stairs and into the waiting taxi. "Will you be right getting him into the hotel room?" Connor asked after he'd plugged Daniel's seatbelt in for him. April cast a hopeful glance at the taxi driver. "You can keep talking as long as you like while the meter's ticking, but I'm not hauling nobody to their hotel room," the driver said with a shrug. "I can help if you need," Connor offered. "No offence, but you're only tiny, and he's kind of heavy set." He could see her hesitation, but when Daniel's head sagged against the leather seats and something between a moan and a snore erupted from his lips, she relented. "You're right," she said. "I'm gonna need a hand." They got in and buckled up. "You come to Adelaide often?" called the taxi driver from the front seat. April and Connor both shook their heads. Daniel snored. "I flew in a few days ago," Connor said. "Hopefully I'll spend more time here, though." "Beautiful city," said the driver, a laconic pride in his tone as he changed lanes and navigated the streets. "Safe as houses. Cleaner than Melbourne. Like a big country town, really." April chuckled. "I'm not so sure about that." Dan left his wallet in his car in Pemwara last week, keys in the ignition in the main street. Both were still there when he came out of the supermarket, but I don't think you'd have the same luck here. While April's view of the city seemed to have been tainted by potential dangers, Connor couldn't help appreciating the anonymity the city afforded him. Since getting on the plane in Manchester, nobody had looked at him with pity or rubbed his arm and asked how he was holding up. "Mind you," he thought as they roused Daniel and helped him to his hotel room, "I've never had a neighbour pulling off my shoes and ushering me into bed when I was completely rat-faced either." "Can you fetch him a glass of water?" April asked, pulling a packet of painkillers from her handbag and sitting them on the bedside table. By the time Connor had returned with the water, she'd written a note on the hotel issue stationery and placed it beside Daniel's bedside table. "He is a lucky guy to have such a nice neighbour," Connor said, grinning at the note, which said exactly that and was signed with a smiley face. Once Daniel was settled, they headed off, both reaching for the elevator button at the same time. "Sorry," Connor laughed, feeling a warmth where her hand brushed his. From the way she jumped backwards, she'd felt it too. "You go," he said. They stood on opposite sides of the lift, and he waited for her to exit first. "Do you want me to walk you out? We'll find you a taxi?" Smothering a yawn, April shook her head. "I'm good, thanks. My hotel's just 2 doors down." Connor said goodbye and headed towards the CBD. He looked back when he reached the traffic lights, but April was nowhere to be seen. He pulled his new phone from his back pocket and dialed his Scottish friend's phone number. "Where's the party at, man?" Despite the loud music in the background, he could hear Fergus cheering. "You're here for a good time, not a long time," Connor reminded himself. April slathered her olive skin with a generous handful of sunscreen, trying to remember the last time the heat had continued so far beyond harvest. The vines at Lacewing Estate had handled the warm weather pretty well, and the grapes had come off without a hitch. But the hot summer had knocked her extensive veggie plot and frazzled the fussiest flowers in the private garden she managed in Mount Gambier. It hadn't been the most memorable summer on a personal level either, and she felt a little like the plants, not yet back to full strength after a rough January and February. Leafy greens brushed April's legs as she walked between the raised garden beds, filling a bucket with sun-warmed tomatoes. She'd been relying on the drip irrigation system to keep her crop hydrated. But as the all-important Penwarra show raced closer, it was clear the garden needed an extra boost. She dragged a sprinkler around the side of the house. Mishka dashed across the yard, and April couldn't help smiling at the fluffy golden dog frolicking in the arc of water, snapping at the droplets. The only downside of having a trophy-winning garden, she mused, is the hot afternoons spent shifting sprinklers and shade cloth instead of swimming. Still, she had a reputation to uphold, and short of a blistering drought, there was no way she'd enter wilted, substandard veggies in the show's produce competition. Once Mishka was soaking wet and suitably sated, they headed towards the winery. Her father, Lloyd, emerged from the Shiraz plot in a wide-brimmed hat that had seen the full gamut of Limestone Coast seasons. Tanned legs peeked out from under his baggy drill shorts, and white chest hairs sprouted from the collar of his faded chambray shirt. Lloyd shaded his eyes and pointed to the stables. "Your renovations are rocketing along," he said, pulling a dog treat out from his pocket for Mishka. "New roof was an instant upgrade." April agreed. True to his word, the builder, Gordon, had worked tirelessly to get the major works done over the last few months, replacing the rafters and riding the local plumbers like a jockey until they finished resheeting the tin. The place was in surprisingly good structural condition for something built over a century ago. Now it's watertight, we can keep working throughout the worst of the weather. A blowfly buzzed past, and although the sun was now nipping at their skin, April knew the blustery winds and lashing rain would be relentless once winter set in. Who would have thought, getting this far on such a fool's folly? The term had been Justin's parting shot, a final sprinkle of salt over her bruised heart. "I never doubted you," Lloyd replied, his wry smile reflecting hers. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "Only a fool would underestimate you, my girl. And that lying, cheating idiot was the fool in this situation. Just remember that." It felt like yesterday that she returned from the Adelaide conference to discover Daniel's partner, Andre, wasn't the only winemaker playing around. April wasn't sure what was more humiliating, finding out Justin had left her for his ex-girlfriend, or her complete obliviousness to his infidelity. Once the initial heartache had eased, she'd thrown herself into the renovations. Converting the old stables, with its crumbling walls and unlimited potential, had proved the perfect project to channel her anger into productivity. April swallowed the lump in her throat and showed her father the new steelwork they'd installed around the entryway, adding strength and security to the original oak doors. Mishka sniffed around the piles of recycled timber flooring for mice and spiders, both of which continued to frequent the building. When April switched on the lights, the room brightened, chasing away the dull ache that came when she thought about Justin. Lloyd gestured to the heavy beams straddling the ceiling. "You gonna paint those?" April was horrified by the suggestion. Not a chance. They're one of my favourite things about the stables. People booking a B&B in the middle of a winery are going for rustic, Dad, not shiny chic. "I'll take your word for it," he said, nodding as she stepped him through the floor plan. It was stuffy inside the stone building, and a sheen of sweat glistened on their foreheads when they returned outside. "Can't say I'll be sorry to see the cooler days arrive," Lloyd said, watching as she locked the double doors before pocketing the key. "Hopefully it eases before the show. If it's this hot, they'll definitely be down on gate numbers and entries. Now, Fran mentioned the cooking section, didn't she?" April blinked. Why would her stepmother mention cooking when she knew April had nothing to contribute? "You mean veggies?" Lloyd shook his head as they walked side by side between the vines. "There's been a stoush in the cooking department. Audrey and Eileen were at war, apparently." April couldn't help laughing. The trestle tables in the cooking pavilion always groaned under the weight of Audrey Cartwright's and Eileen Mawson's baking, and there was little doubt the two ladies could single-handedly feed Penwara's entire population for morning tea if they pooled their show day entries. Haven't they been threatening to pull out for years? I'll believe it when I see it. "Don't laugh," said Lloyd, snipping off a few spent bunches of grapes the pickers had missed. "I think it's serious this time. Fran said they're boycotting the event if the show society doesn't appoint a new judge." He gave a guilty laugh. "And she may have nominated us to cook a few things to help fill the tables." Of all the things April had imagined for the week ahead, cooking was so far off the list of priorities that she found herself chuckling. "You're hilarious, Dad," she said, calling Mishka back to her side. "But thanks for the laugh, I needed that." She grinned as she turned to him, and it was only when she met his eye that she realized he was half serious. "Given we can't really help with donations this year, I've said we'll help out this way instead." He paused, looking sheepish now. April shook her head, clipping the lead back on Mishka, who was intently eyeing off a little blue wren. No, she said. "You've got the wrong person for the job. I'd try putting together a posy or entering the flowers if the garden section was desperate, and you know I'll fill the produce tables with whatever veggies survive this heatwave. But I'm the wrong gal for baking. You know it, Fran knows it, even Mishka knows it." The dog barked as the blue wren flitted away to safety. "You didn't know anything about renovating either, but I've seen you helping out with this project. Every time I walk past, you're leaning over the sawhorse or learning how to use a new power tool." April rolled her eyes. "Only because I have to, Dad. Justin was meant to be the hands-on helper. I was just supposed to take care of marketing the darn thing. But it's not brain surgery. It'd be like you jumping from the winemaking to designing labels and doing all the bottling. You'd do it if you had to, but that doesn't mean you'd voluntarily put yourself in front of the firing squad." She wasn't sure if it was the heat or the complete ridiculousness of his suggestion that had her mixing up her metaphors, but April felt pressured. Her dad and stepmother had never asked her to cook anything. They must be light on. She cast her gaze across the large mud brick house on the eastern side of the vineyard, and in the distance saw Fran waving back at them from the clothesline. Lloyd raised his hand, but instead of waving, he gave the thumbs-up signal. April grabbed his arm, pulling it down. "You've already registered me, haven't you?" she groaned theatrically. "It's just to get plates on the table, love. You know how the committee gets about these things." April did know. In between winery commitments, her stepmother spent endless hours chasing, cajoling, plotting, and planning ways to keep the show relevant and vibrant in the face of changing community interests. "Maybe if they can't fill the tables," she said gently, "it's time they threw in the towel." Lloyd balked. "Don't say that in front of Fran. It's the 98th show and they're determined to make it to the centenary. I can burn water as well as the next person, and Fran's put my name down for a chocolate cake in the blokes section. It's just to make up numbers, and nobody'll know they're our entries. Anything's better than nothing." Connor woke to a persistent noise somewhere outside the house. He prized his eyes open, squinting against the light filtering through the thin curtains, and struggling to work out who might be rapping on the door at the crack of dawn on a Friday. "I'm coming," he grumbled, pulling on a pair of jeans. It wasn't until he was halfway through the lounge room that he realized the noise was coming from his housemate's bedroom across the hallway, not the front door. Connor was no stranger to the dynamics of sharehouse living. Awkward flat-sharing experiences in London and backpacker hostels in Europe were par for the course, but his tolerance of his loved-up housemates had worn thin over the last 3 months. He cleared his throat, hoping it might remind them how easily the sound carried through the flimsy walls. The banging stopped, followed by a giggle. Connor finished dressing quickly and slipped his toothbrush and toothpaste into his backpack, then grabbed a banana from the kitchen counter. Strictly speaking, the fruit was his housemate's, but Connor reasoned it was a fair trade for the awkward early morning wake-up. He shut the front door firmly behind him, unlocking the Camry he'd bought on Gumtree. The car had blown a tyre on its maiden voyage from Adelaide and coughed out more smoke than a Newcastle coal mine. But it had been cheap, which, given the volatility of his boss Johan, had proved a smart decision. Although his working day didn't start until 8 a.m, Connor had been leaving the house earlier and earlier to avoid the flushed faces of his housemates. The vibe at the share house was the polar opposite of his new workplace, where the tension and camaraderie made it feel as cold as a snowy Christmas. Connor pulled into the winery car park, unsurprised to see Johan's Audi already there, and tried to guess what mood the boss was in today. He finished the banana, wishing he'd detoured past the shops for a proper breakfast, then leaned out of the car, using his water bottle to moisten his toothbrush and wash his face. Connor waited until the piano-heavy jazz track finished before locking the Camry, pocketing the keys, and making his way inside. "Morning, Johan," he said, stowing his backpack in the staff lockers. "What's on the agenda today?" The winemaker ignored him, taking a sample from one of the oak barrels. It was only after he'd swirled and sniffed and scowled at the red wine that he acknowledged Connor. Another one of those days, then. Connor made a small plunger of coffee and took his laptop to the timber table outside the barrel room. The week seemed warm for early autumn, with the soft golden light spreading across the vineyards and not a whisper of breeze. Connor skimmed his inbox, pleased to spot Fergus Abernathy's name. He eagerly read the reply, hoping he hadn't sounded like a whinger in his email last night. From all accounts, his Scottish friend was having a great time in the Limestone Coast and sounded delighted to weigh in on the matter. Connor looked at his watch, then dialed Fergus, who answered on the first ring. "All right, pal. Sounds like Rossvale isn't treating you so well." Connor glanced through the window where Johan was making his way along the tanks, checking the fermentation. "The winery's nice, but the mosquitoes are friendlier than the guy running the place." "Well, there are plenty of class wineries down this way. If you don't like the one you're at, join me. You heard from the rest of the crew. A few have already jumped ship for other wineries," Fergus said. "You wouldn't be the first." Connor hadn't kept in touch with many of the expats who had flown into Adelaide with him in January, but the news made him feel better about the decision. He ended the call and quietly packed his laptop away, still uncertain about calling time at Rossvale. But by the end of the day, after Johan had sacked a cellar hand and made a viticulturalist cry, Connor handed in his notice. He passed dozens of vineyards on his way out of town, knowing he could have approached other local wineries. But the lure of Penwara wasn't just about the grapes or his Scottish mate. Not for the first time, he thought of April Lacey and the marketing tips she'd been so keen to learn at the conference. Had she put them into action since January? Was the guy in her phone photographs still in the picture? Would she be happy to see him? Or had she barely spared a thought for him since? He set the Camry's cruise control and sat back in his seat. Only one way to find out. 3. "He did what?" Lauren Bickford looked up from the pot she was stirring and turned in April's direction, her mouth agape. With the bubbling saucepans of tomatoes on the stove, the little winemaker's cottage was like a sauna, a tomato-scented sauna. April unwound the windows to their limit, hoping for a hint of a breeze. After flicking the ceiling fan up to high, April updated her housemate on the show baking scenario. "Tell me you're not actually going through with it." Lauren's face was creased with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "I've seen you baking, and it ain't pretty." "I know, but fortunately, entries only have names displayed if they're winners, so only the steward and I will know it's my disaster." Even as she said it, April felt unease skittering through her stomach. Her natural instinct was steering clear of things unless she was sure she could do them well. Lauren scooped up a spoonful of relish, blew on it, and sampled it before handing the spoon to April. More salt? April let the hot mixture tingle on her tongue. It tastes like relish to me. She shrugged apologetically. Her father, Lloyd, had been able to taste the difference in grape varieties from a young age, and as much as she'd tried to follow in his footsteps and discern the taste, smell, and texture of their wines throughout the fermenting and winemaking process, she'd never mastered the skill. It was part of the reason she avoided cooking, too. It's good, though, she added quickly. Is this for the show? Yeah, Lauren nodded, adding a pinch of salt anyway. You can't be the only trophy winner in the household. Even if your cake is raw in the middle, you'll be the queen of the produce section like every other year. April stood on tiptoe and lifted the perpetual trophy from the overhead shelving. It still gave her a thrill to see her name engraved on the plaque multiple times, and as she buffed the small cup, she caught sight of her father's name from 2 decades ago, and, a little further down, her grandmother's name. We'll see, April said, returning it to the shelf between a finicky maidenhair fern and a trailing Hoya that needed trimming. Brian Trelaw said his veggie garden is in tip-top shape this year, and young Archie Winkland from next door will be giving me a run for my money at this rate. I mightn't win a thing. Lauren tasted the relish again, and, seemingly pleased with the flavour, turned the stovetop down and stacked the glass jars inside the warm oven for sterilising. I'll believe it when I see it. Archie's lucky to be learning from the best. He'll scoop the juniors' pool in the produce section, surely. And what does Daniel say about it all? Shouldn't that be something a brother could teach him instead of a neighbour? Daniel's got 2 black thumbs, and their dad Rupert doesn't have the patience for it. I don't mind. Archie's a good kid. April moved around the kitchen, pulling out a cookbook from Lauren's extensive collection. Hopefully he'll win something. Archie's worked hard on his corner of the veggie garden. A ribbon or 2 will be just the encouragement he needs to keep at it. Leafing through the glossy book with its photos of brimming mixing bowls, precisely floured bench tops and artfully messy drips of batter was disheartening. But the thought of Fran fretting about empty tables on show day outweighed April's doubts. It's just a stupid cake to help Fran. Get over yourself. April shoved a slip of paper into the most basic butter cake recipe, one with ingredients she could pronounce, then helped Lauren spoon the hot relish into the jars. If you've got enough tomatoes in the patch for sauce and chutney, I'll make those on the weekend too. April balked. Don't we already have enough to sink a ship? Pfft. Lauren twisted the lid on the final jar. No such thing. A little tweak here and a new flavour there. I'll be taking as many varieties to the show as possible. After washing up, they headed outside to assess the tomato crops. I think I'll get a few more kilos from the Roma tomatoes and the Black Russians, but the cherry toms are about done, and the last of the beefcakes are on the bush, April said, studying the plot. For all her faults in the kitchen, the garden was a place April had always excelled. The raised beds were lush with greenery, and all manner of autumn vegetables were nestled in the soil and gleaming in the afternoon sun. April followed the concrete path around the shaded side of the house and switched off the sprinkler before returning to the tomatoes. She eased a yellow grape tomato from the vine, relishing the moment the sun-warmed fruit exploded in her mouth. I don't want to leave you short for show weekend, though, Lauren said, cradling a cluster of heirloom miniatures. Worst case scenario, I could buy a carton of tomatoes. Just take my heart and rip it in 2, said April, feigning offence, before pitching an overripe cherry tomato at her friend. Mishka pranced between them, amped up by their laughter. The tomato narrowly missed Lauren and splattered against the path, just missing the cream and ochre walls. You're cleaning that up, Lauren said. And while you're at it, you might want to tidy yourself up too. We've got plans tonight. April groaned, fanning her face. I've got mountains of work to do, Loz. The building site isn't going to clean itself, and I'd rather Gordon spend his time labouring, not carrying wood scraps to the skip bin or sweeping sawdust. Not to mention my paid work. I've got plants to water and need to write a winter fertilising and pruning schedule to send to my client before the end of the weekend. She hosed the tomato pulp off the path. And did I mention I need to start thinking about the website for the bed and breakfast so customers can actually book accommodation? Lauren crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by April's protests. You can't spend every spare minute renovating. And it's too warm to work tonight, you said so yourself. There's no way you're backing out now, we've got a booking in Beachport. Lauren gave her another grin, then retreated inside. Tell me it's not Zumba again, April called after her, still unsure whether she should be grateful or insulted by Lauren's regular attempts to liven up her social life. The tomato smell lingered inside the house, and April had to admit that after such a stinking hot day, the beach seemed like the perfect destination. But when she emerged from the shower, the sight of Lauren rifling through her wardrobe told her it mightn't be quite as straightforward as she'd hoped. What, we need more than bathers, sunglasses and a stubby holder? Lauren thrust her a floaty floral sundress and a pair of pink sandals at her. Swim first, then I booked a table for 4 at Bumpers. A table for 4? April sighed. Does Jean Delacourt have anything to do with this? Jean prided herself on being the town Cupid, making it her business to set up all the young people in town. Both April and Lauren had suffered through several of Jean Delacourt's matchups over the years. Lauren ignored the question. A sinking feeling settled in April's stomach as her housemate strode to the door. The little rental property at the Penwarra golf course wasn't big, Connor soon discovered, but what it lacked in size and style, it more than made up for in company and location. Surrounded by well-watered and carefully manicured greens, the house was nestled among gum trees, and only a short drive from town. The best bit is that little clubhouse over yonder, said Fergus, pointing out the large building in the distance. The 19th hole, it's called. Amazing tucker, cheap beers, and good kin. You'll be happy here, Con, I've no doubt. We'll find you a job in no time. With Fergus's help and a running commentary about the town's attractions and highlights, Connor was soon unpacked. Shall I rustle us up something to eat, or do you fancy hitting the town? Fergus asked. Connor didn't have to look at his watch to know that bed was calling him. An early start, a full day's work, and then a 5-hour drive south had taken its toll. A bag of crisps is about the extent of my enthusiasm tonight, Connor said, watching his Scottish mate rummage around in the pantry. Nah, it's no bother, said Fergus, heaping the bench top with rice, eggs, spices, and tinned tomatoes. Don't go to any trouble on my part, really, said Connor. I'll just have a shower, call my folks, and crawl into bed. I'm zonked. Fergus emptied the random ingredients into a fry pan and switched on the gas hob. While he didn't know much about cooking, Connor was pretty sure those items didn't all belong in the pan together at the same time. Call it a housewarming present, said Fergus, cracking open a beer. By the time you get out of the shower, this glorious concoction should be cooked. Although the water pressure was underwhelming and the shower was one of those over-the-bath contraptions that required his full attention on exiting, Connor felt like a new man when he donned fresh shorts and a t-shirt. A haze of smoke and persistent beeping greeted him in the hallway, and it took a huge effort not to laugh at Fergus standing under the smoke alarm, waving a tea towel like a surrender flag. Now you're just making me homesick, chuckled Connor, quickly opening the kitchen windows. The fry pan with their supper, or what had been intended as such, was now smouldering outside the front door. I thought charcoal du jour was only my specialty. Fergus groaned. I barely left it for 5 minutes. Sorry, mate, not much of a welcome. I'm not a cook's elbow either, trust me, but it was awfully nice of you to offer. Connor took a beer from the fridge and held open the back door. An ale under the stars sounds like a top alternative. Fergus pulled out 2 chairs, and they caught up under the moonlit sky. As Connor listened to the sounds of animals and birds calling in the distance, and the wind rustling through the gum leaves, he got the feeling he was going to like it in Penwarra. They tossed their empties into the recycling drum afterwards. I better call home, he said, thanking Fergus again for his hospitality, and heading into the spare bedroom where they'd unpacked his things. He opened his laptop, and within moments the lounge room of his family home in Derbyshire, England, came into view. Hey up, here's our boy! Jock Jameson loomed so close to the screen Connor could see the individual bristles of his beard and an alarmingly close-range view of his nose hair. Oh, you look tired, love. Are you getting enough sleep? His mum Sharon chimed in, swinging the computer screen around and nestling in cheek to cheek with her husband. She long believed sleep and tea to be the cures to all ailments, no matter how old you were. All good, ma'am, just a big day. Hey, Nell, are you Pippin? The video screen lurched sideways as his little sisters moved the laptop and crammed onto the couch beside their parents. When are you coming home, Con? Pippin hugged a colourful ukulele to her chest. Connor chuckled. Same answer as last week, Pipsqueak. It's still a 2-year visa. Anyone would think you're missing me. Nell leaned in close, the light of the computer screen glinting off her braces. We do. There's this super annoying kid in class. He thinks he's the king of year 8. I've already told him to stop being such a complete knob, but if you were home, I could at least tell him my big brother's ready and willing to go a few rounds. He'd take one look at how tall and strong you are and pee his pants. Nellie Jameson. Their mother swatted her on the arm. Connor chuckled. There was no debating his height, but he'd always thought of himself as fit rather than strong. If he'd had to choose between music and muscles, he'd pick Beethoven, Nat King Cole, and the Beatles in a heartbeat. How's your new housemate, lad? Jock asked. And have you found a new job yet, then? They better treat you better than that joker in Rossvale. Connor hooked an arm behind his head and leaned against the wrought-iron bedhead. Given I've only been here a few hours, I'm still currently unemployed. But my housemate Fergus is a good bloke, and he'll put in a good word at a few of the wineries. Good to hear. Right then, you lot, we better let our Con get some shut-eye, said Jock. You look like you're spent, lad. Off you go, then. And send us some photos of your new place, said Pippin, strumming a tune as the others waved goodbye. It's probably not as nice as your old flat, not without Phoebe there to make it all pretty. Sharon chimed in with a reprimand before Connor had even thought up an appropriate response. They're only kids. They don't mean anything by it, Jock apologised. Connor waved it away. No bother. Just because he'd tried to remove all traces of Phoebe Lawson from his life, it didn't mean everyone in his orbit had to do the same. What? What'd I say? Said Pippin, still bewildered as Jock signed off for the night. Connor was about to shut his laptop when an email popped up on the screen. A tired smile crept across his face as he opened it. He'd been offered an interview for the head winemaker's gig at an award-winning Herefordshire winery. Mum and Dad will like this. He took a screenshot at the email and forwarded it to his dad, who'd pushed him to apply for the role. It was the type of opportunity he would have accepted in a heartbeat 5 years ago. He wouldn't be accepting it, not with his Aussie adventure underway, but the offer was validating anyway. If a winery of that calibre was reaching out now, similar opportunities would arise when he returned after his stint in Australia. 2 years down under was just the fresh start he needed. Connor took one last look out the window at the twinkling Australian stars, searching out the brightest one through the stretch of glass, before rolling over and closing his eyes. April flung open the curtains in her bedroom and studied the sky. It was a glorious day with barely a cloud to be seen, and she could already feel the warmth of the sun through the window pane. Like everyone in the district, she was looking forward to more bearable temperatures. Maybe it'll give me more patience when dealing with morons, she thought, recalling the stunned silence the night before when she had told her blind date exactly what he could do with his octopus hands.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Mishka tore down the hallway and dropped a tatty tennis ball at April's feet. A beautiful dog, the prettiest home in the district, a great job and good friends. Who needs men, hey, Mish? The dog barked, as if that arrangement was fine by her too. April picked up her phone and saw a message from the builder, Gordon. She quickly replaced her pyjamas with a sleeveless work shirt and denim shorts. If he was coming into work on the weekend, she wanted to be ready to lend a hand the moment he arrived. April kicked the dog's tennis ball across the room, then laughed when Mishka emerged from under the bed with dust bunnies stuck to her whiskers and the ball between her teeth. You heading to the stables? I thought you were gardening and baking this morning. Lauren leaned against the bedroom doorframe, a pen and shopping list in one hand and a recipe book in the other. April ducked past her down the hall and into the kitchen. Yeah, I was planning on it, but Gordon's available, so I'll be his lackey. Maybe he'll let me near the nail gun today, she said, slotting 2 thick slices of sourdough into the toaster. Coffee? I think I should be making you coffee after last night. Lauren cringed, setting the recipe book down by the espresso machine. Rowan sounded much better in Jean's phone call than in the flesh, I promise. April waved away Lauren's apology. It's not your fault he was a creep. But there was a silver lining at least. That you didn't toss a glass of water over him or storm out halfway through dessert? April grinned at her housemate and shook her head. Don't try telling me he didn't deserve it. No, the good news is that Mr. Octopus won't be breaking this heart anytime soon. In fact, after I tell Jean Delacourt about last night, she'll probably scratch him off her list of eligible bachelors. The kitchen buzzed with the sound of grinding beans, and soon the room was filled with the glorious aroma of coffee and warm bread. If that's the quality of guys Jean's rounding up, I'd hate to see the ones she knocks back, said Lauren, frothing the milk and handing April a steaming cup. I'd rather do Zumba or gardening on a 40-degree day than go on any more blind dates, April said. Please promise you'll give me more than 40 minutes' notice before you pull a stunt like that again. Would you have come? Lauren pulled the butter towards her, slathering an extra thick wedge onto her sourdough before holding up a finger. As much as I adore you, April, I don't want to be sitting here in 20 years sharing coffee and toast in matching dressing gowns, wondering why I'm still single. We have to take opportunities as they arise. Don't let me stand in the way of your dating schemes. I'd just personally rather sweat it out in the gym or distributing a few cubic meters of mulch. That Justin, Lauren rolled her eyes. He's got a lot to answer for. April had never been more grateful for her friend than in the month after Justin left. As well as keeping up the supply of chocolate, tissues, and wine, Lauren had happily removed all the Justin-related photographs and mementos from their house, so that when April emerged from the post-breakup fog, there was barely a trace of his presence in the winemaker's cottage. I'm in no hurry to repeat that mistake, especially not with a loser who thinks he's entitled to cop a feel just because he bought me dinner. True, Lauren conceded. Oh, before you head off, do you have any special requests for the next batch of sauce? I've already got chili jam, fruity tomato chutney, tomato and capsicum relish, regular sauce, and sauce from the CWA recipe book. But I'm keen to make a few more varieties. Cover all the bases, you know? You're mad. It's even hotter today than yesterday. I'm on a mission, Lauren announced, flicking through the cookbook. If you'd just let me teach you, you'd see there's nothing to this cooking business. April smiled and shook her head. Lauren was a brilliant friend, but April knew from experience that she wasn't a natural-born cooking instructor. Gulping down her coffee, she strode over to the stables with Mishka. Grass had started growing around the wheels of Gordon's tradie trailer, which had been parked there since he'd taken the job on. Knowing he wouldn't be far away, she opened the trailer box and pulled out the portable radio. Half an hour passed quickly as she cleared the dust and debris from the job site, listening to the radio station's gardening show. April's mind skipped ahead as she cleaned. Soon, the bulk of the building work would be done, and she'd be able to start landscaping. She had already earmarked some reliable standards like box hedge, lavender, and rosemary for the garden base, with a few flowers and annuals to add colour and form. And a small veggie garden, of course, she thought, imagining guests picking their own herbs if they fancied fresh basil or parsley on their omelettes, or sun-kissed tomatoes on the side. Omelettes weren't something she'd ever cooked for herself, but researching the bed and breakfast market, it seemed hosts who value-added, providing goods like locally sourced eggs and warm loaves of homemade bread, scored high on the customer experience feel-good scale. She was so busy daydreaming about happy customers with higher culinary skills than her own that April didn't realise Gordon had arrived until he walked through the oak doors. Howdy, she set aside the broom, eager to see what task they'd be tackling today. Hey, he replied flatly, his gaze flitting around the room. April waited for him to mention the tidy workspace, or at least rattle off the day's tasks, and were surprised when he instead turned to their supplies, carefully measuring the timber and making a lot of ing noises. "You've measured the length 3 times now," she said. "Everything okay?" Gordon pulled out his pocket knife and sharpened his pencil with careful, considered movements. "This job might take a little longer than we expected," he admitted finally. "We'll run up against the edge of your budget before long, so we're either going to need more volunteers or an increase in the budget to get it done on time, I'm afraid." "I thought we were on track," April said quickly, "and I factored in a buffer, but I really wanted to be open for spring so we can iron out any kinks before the serious tourist season starts. How much more money are we talking?" Gordon looked apologetic as he explained the additional expenses and handed over an invoice from the timber supplier. "They've had a price hike too, to cover the extra delivery costs. I'm sorry," he said. "I know it's not what you want to hear, but I wanted to give you a heads up now." He gave her a ballpark figure of the extras they'd need to consider. The details sat like a rock in the bottom of her stomach as they worked, and they finished a little later than usual, both of them intent on getting the maximum value from each length of timber. "We haven't got this far into it to give up now," April said finally, locking the double doors behind them and waving Gordon off. There has to be a way to make this work, April thought, striding across to the winery. I just need to find it. She closed the door of Lacewing Estate behind her, forcing her lips into a tight smile when she spotted Fran. But the grimace didn't fool her stepmother, who took one look at her and realised something was amiss. "You're the spitting image of your mother when you frown like that, pet. Is it the cooking? You haven't burned the cottage down, have you?" Fran went back into the tea room and emerged shortly after with a tray. Setting it down on the cluttered wine-tasting bar, she peered out the window in the direction of April's house. "I'm pleased you're helping with the show baking, but only if it's not too much trouble." April took a Monte Carlo from the biscuit barrel. "The cooking's the least of my troubles," she said. Maybe this stables project was doomed from the start. First Justin hot-footed out of here, now the costs and the timeline are blowing out. Am I the only one who thinks it's not completely mad? Fran removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "It's not straightforward, I'll give you that. But we're behind you, April. Your dad was saying just last night how proud he was of all the work you've done so far. Of course, he'd rather you were in the winery with him every day." April took a bite of her biscuit. We all know how well that'd go. With their contrasting views on technology and operational matters, and her rusty winemaking skills, April found it easier working for someone else. She helped as was needed at the vineyard, especially during harvest and pruning, but she liked the independence her full-time horticulture job at Lawton Gardens offered. "We've loved seeing you pour your heart and soul into this project. If a B&B keeps you connected to Lacewing Estate, then that's pretty special to us. What can we do to help?" April didn't need to look far to confirm Lacewing Estate wasn't in a position to shell out extra funds for this project. Her eyes lingered on the paintwork puckered up by salt damp and the bottle labels that had barely changed since Lloyd took over. "This is supposed to be a project to help boost the winery, not suck extra funds from the coffers," April insisted. "I'll think of something." As she walked back to the winemaker's cottage she'd called home for almost 10 years, she fervently hoped she was right. Archie Winklin sat on the front step of April's veranda, a wheelbarrow at the ready. "You're late," the young boy called, jumping to his feet and jamming a straw hat onto his head. Mishka strained at the end of her leash, eager for his attention. "Oh, Arch." She'd forgotten he was coming today. April let go of the leash. "Can we take a rain check?" His face fell. Archie buried his head in Mishka's shaggy coat and began to sing. As April got nearer, her own problems receded as she heard his mournful song, not quite muffled by the dog hair. "Nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms." A giggle escaped her, surprising them both. "Now there's a blast from the past. I didn't realise anyone still sang that song," she said, sinking onto the step beside him. How does it go again? Archie looked up, eyes narrowed and bottom lip jutting out as if trying to establish whether she was pulling his leg or not. Go on, I could do with a good song today. Nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms. He sang the first line again, his petulant tone perfectly complementing the playground ditty. She nodded encouragingly. Short ones, tall ones. Archie shook his head. No, that's not right. He leaned his head against Mishka's golden back and began the second verse. Long ones, short ones, fat ones, skinny ones, worms that squiggle and squirm, April finished, assessing Archie's face and his choice of song. I'm not the only one having a rough day. What's up, short stuff? Surely you've got something better to do on a Saturday than garden with me. What about your brother? Half-brother. Archie's clarification was automatic. Daniel's gone to Victoria, Dad's busy with the wine like always, Mum's working, and all my friends are away for the school holidays. Nobody wants to hang out with me, not even Marty and Barbara. Ever since Dad shifted them to the big paddock with the older sheep, they don't want a bar from me. April tickled him under the chin. You're telling me Barbara and Marty don't want a bar of you? That got him laughing. Maybe if you'd called them hamburger and chops, like Dan suggested, they'd be better behaved. Maybe. Archie turned to study her, still clinging to the dog. Why did you say you needed a song? He doesn't miss a beat. Just boring money stuff, she said, scanning the rows of vines surrounding her little cottage. Boring, expensive, potentially project-ending stuff. And nobody hates you, buddy. You know that, right? His nod was so small she wouldn't have seen it if she hadn't been looking directly at his freckled, sun-bronzed cheeks. If you don't want me here, then I'll probably go home and die of boredom, he said, using his hat to fan himself. Dwelling on her renovation budget worries wouldn't help right now, but perhaps a few hours in the garden would. Well, we can't have that then, can we? You may as well help me. He jumped to his feet and headed for the garden shed, Mishka hot on his heels. Can we work on my veggie patch first? Pretty please? We can have it weeded in no time. She nodded, watching him shift gears with the ease of a rally driver and wishing she could do the same. Archie emerged from the shed with gardening gloves, spades, and buckets looped over his gangly arms, beaming from ear to ear. Crisis of confidence over. Archie carried the tools to the raised garden bed he'd helped build during the summer holidays. It was half the size of April's veggie patch, but he'd helped her cut, cart, and arrange the old railway sleepers, and he'd spent hours lining it with plastic and filling it with soil, one small shovel after another. With her guidance, he'd planted it out with seeds purchased from his pocket money. Only a smattering of veggies from Archie's inaugural crop would be ready in time for the upcoming show, but he had grand plans to ensure it was brimming with produce the following March. April pulled her gloves on. Right then, you know which ones are the weeds and which ones are the seedlings? Archie nodded, quickly identifying them before tackling the task. Soon his small plot was weed-free, watered, and covered with a layer of mulch. As he worked, Archie told April about his lambs and ideas for the upcoming show. Do you think I could enter Mishka in the best dressed pet competition? Dad says my lambs are too much trouble to take to the show, but Mishka's good on a lead, he said hopefully, looking up from his plot. I'm not sure you can enter someone else's pet, she hedged, not wanting another responsibility on show day. It was enough that she'd agreed to bake, as well as helping Archie with his veggies and her own. Let me think about it over afternoon smoko. Leading him beneath the shady gum, April wiped her gloves on her denim shorts and handed Archie a water bottle. Do you think I'll get a championship show trophy like you one year, April? She took a big mouthful from her own bottle, relishing the cool water, then opened a packet of twisties. Anyone can grow stuff in this dirt, Arch. It's some of the best soil in the country, and the reward's in the growing, not the showing. Archie groaned before taking a handful of twisties.
You only say that because you always win.
Not always. But the more you grow and the more you enter, the better your chance of winning something. We've got 12 months until the next show. Plenty of time for you to get a few crops under your belt and whip your veggie garden into shape. There was a spring in Archie's step as he headed for home. He paused at the end of her lawn and turned head over heels in a cartwheel, barely breaking stride. "Show off?" April laughed. The young boy did another for good measure, called a cheerful farewell, and then disappeared between the vines. April leaned against the gum tree, trying to recall the last time she'd cartwheeled and sang playground ditties. Nepal, perhaps? Closing her eyes, she thought of the months she'd spent living at the foot of the Himalayas after her parents' divorce. Her mum, Polly, had been swept up in the excitement of their overseas adventure, relishing her new classrooms and colleagues, the foreign languages and fresh friendships. It was the afternoons that April found the hardest. She missed the routine and familiarity of the vineyard. A simple yearning for the after-school winery tasks quickly gave way to a desperate longing for home that Polly struggled to understand. There had been teary nights with maps spread across the table, suggestions made for countries April might like better, promises of more pocket money and unlimited long-distance phone calls to hopefully ease her homesickness. But when the plane touched down in Adelaide, 7 months after they'd left, and the flight attendant had asked if they were visiting or returning home, April's relieved answer had sealed the deal. Lloyd was ecstatic. Polly continued teaching in far-flung places, sending her love via postcards, parcels, and phone calls to the winery. Fran's arrival helped fill the void, and after a while, April stopped minding her mum's absence. Mishka ambled over, dropping a well-chewed builder's pencil at her feet. "No use dwelling on the past when the future needs our attention, right, Mish?" April fetched her laptop and returned to the outdoor setting. She was pulling up the B&B spreadsheet when a kookaburra called in the distance. She listened to the birds' laughter and the subsequent replies that echoed from the neighbouring trees. That's it. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. There was only so long she could keep calling the bed and breakfast the stables, and there was plenty of local bird life in the gum trees dotted throughout the winery. Kookaburra cabin? Kookaburra shack? April paused, then quickly hammered on the delete key. No, too informal. She paused, absent-mindedly nibbling a hangnail and tossing around a few more names in her head before committing them to the spreadsheet. Kookaburra Lodge? Kookaburra Inn? April glanced at the winemaker's cottage, then back to the small stone building that was steadily taking up a big part of her heart, then deleted all the previous ideas. How could it be anything other than Kookaburra Cottage? With a smile, April renamed the spreadsheet, hit save, and hoped prospective guests would be just as charmed by Kookaburra Cottage. Now she just had to find a way to finish the renovations. 4. Connor looked around the Penwarra clubhouse a week after arriving in the district, feeling slightly out of place in a room full of people he'd never met. He ordered 2 pints and checked his phone to find an update from Fergus, who was running late. Connor paid for the dirt-cheap drinks and perched on a cushioned stool beside a display case of trophies. The club was brimming with golfers, who looked to be the same vintage as his parents.
Were you one of the Kalangadoo players? I don't remember seeing a strapping young lad like you on the course today.
Connor turned to look at the woman waiting at the bar beside him. Kalanga, what's it? Is she talking to me? Not me, I'm afraid, he said. I've just moved into a little rental over the hill with Fergus. The short lady beamed, patting his arm, and introduced herself as Jean Delacourt.
Oh, Fergus, he's a pet. We've asked him to give a talk at Probus next month. Perhaps you can come along too and we can hear what brings you to our beautiful district. If I were a gambling lady, I'd wager you're either in winemaking or teaching. Or,
she rubbed her hands together,
Please tell me you're the new doctor we've been waiting for.
Although Jean hadn't ordered, the barman arrived before them with a glass of house wine and took her money. A regular then, obviously. Winemaker. Connor sipped his beer. Though it sounds like you need doctors more than winemakers at the moment.
Crying out for 'em, she confirmed. But for some reason we can't seem to get 'em here. And when we do, we have trouble convincing them to stay longer than a year or so. It's a lovely town, take my word for it. But the distance from the city scares some people off. Are you a city boy yourself?
It had been a while since anyone called me a boy, Connor thought with a smile. I've mostly lived in villages or cities, so this is quite new to me. Noticing her raised eyebrows, he hurried on. But I can already tell it's a brilliant spot here, with all the fresh air and space. From the expression on her face, it was clear he'd said the right thing. She waved her hand at the bartender again, and a packet of crisps appeared in a cane basket. Jean climbed onto the bar stool beside him. Despite Connor's protests, she heaped a handful of potato chips onto a napkin and sat it in front of him.
Go on, then,
she said, waiting until he'd taken one before continuing her potted history of the town.
And you'll just love the community.
Jean paused for a sip of wine.
We look after our own around here. Bob Nellestein over there was really sick a few years back.
She pointed to a man with a green golf cap and high socks.
We all jumped in to help with lawn mowing, and the footy club ran a firewood raffle to help with petrol while he travelled to the city for treatment.
She cast another glance around the room, warming to her topic.
A funeral's always a good excuse for a community cook-up, too, Jean continued. Dot over there was bedridden with shock when her Ronald died, even though he'd had a good innings. 79 he was, but still the poor love was heartbroken. The Pennant girls and I set up a roster so she had hot meals for a week or two. Pasties, casseroles, soups and stir-fries, you name it, we cooked it.
Connor was impressed. They knew their immediate neighbours in Derbyshire, and his parents had many musical friends, but as far as he knew, nobody had ever dropped a casserole at their front door. Jean was delighted when he told her as much.
That's the country charm, she said, heaping a few more crisps onto his napkin. We've got lots of committees and the like. You'll feel like a local in no time if you're happy lending a hand here and there.
Thanks, Jean, I'll keep it in mind, Connor promised, finishing his beer and looking at the one he'd ordered for Fergus. If his housemate was much longer, the beer would be at British pub temperature instead of the icy cold brew he knew his friend favoured. As if on cue, the main door opened and Fergus lumbered through, greeting half the people in the club as if they were old friends, and the rest like they were new friends waiting to happen.
Over here, Fergus,
Jean called, waving at him from across the room.
I've got to know him quite well over a few baskets of chips, she confided. If my granddaughter still lived locally, I'd have no hesitation setting the two of them up. Still, there are plenty of lovely young ladies in the district. I'm sure I'll come up with the perfect match.
Her eyes shone, and he guessed it wasn't the first time she'd played matchmaker. Jean, I see you've met Connor already. Fergus looked like a giant beside the wren-like lady. She nodded, patting Connor's arm.
I have indeed,
she said, offering the last of the chips to Fergus. The Scotsman had no hesitation in accepting, and he listened attentively as Jean updated him on a hedge Fergus had apparently helped her prune. Connor ordered a fresh pint for himself and a wine for Jean, before ducking to the bathroom. When he returned, Fergus was deep in conversation with another local. It wasn't hard to see why his Scottish friend had integrated so easily into the new town. He remembered people's names and went out of his way to talk to them. Is it normally this packed? Connor asked Fergus once he'd finished his conversation, gesturing to the crowd and watching the waitstaff drag extra tables across the room, laying out more napkins, cutlery and wine glasses. There's a fair crowd most Friday nights, but this one's a little bigger. They hosted a tournament today. Safe to say they'll be putting on the best tucker for their visitors, said Fergus, rubbing his hands in anticipation. Connor's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he opened a message from his little sister, Pippin.
Those kangaroos are brilliant. Can you FaceTime me tomorrow if they're still around so I can see 'em hopping?
Connor checked with Fergus before replying. Oh, they'll be there all right, Fergus confirmed. The greenskeeper said they're worse than vermin. You know, they've got kangaroo on the menu tonight, if you're keen to sink your choppers in. Connor shuddered, not quite ready to reconcile the Aussie icon with a menu item, or imagine them being considered pests. He wouldn't mention that to Pippin or Nell tomorrow. A man with a microphone encouraged patrons to find their seats. Weaving through the families and friends, Connor followed Fergus to the far corner of the room, just between the bar and the bathrooms. Best spot in the house when they're doing these formal nights, Fergus said with a wink. Their table was beside a wall covered in photographs of club champions, taken on a night just like this, and next to a familiar cloth-covered shape. Connor lifted the linen sheet, a quick glimpse confirming it was indeed a piano. His fingers were itching to dance across the ivories, and he realised how much he'd missed playing music in the past 3 months. The upright piano wasn't as tall as the one he'd grown up with, but he'd taught many young students on models just like this. Who had banished it to the corner and hidden it under a sheet? Nice, Connor murmured. You're looking at that piano like it's the best thing you've seen all week, said Fergus, nudging him with an elbow. You play? Connor nodded, then replaced the sheet and turned slowly, his mind skipping ahead. Johann had insisted his staff kept their weeknights free so they were available for whatever wine-making tasks he saw fit to ask of them, which had ruled out the opportunity to start teaching piano lessons. But perhaps if he couldn't find a winery job, he could cover his rent with lessons here. It wouldn't hurt to ask. April's week was a rush of cooking failures, budget revisions, and much head-scratching, so by the time Friday rolled around, the last thing she felt like doing was presenting a trophy at the golf tournament. But she took one look at her father, hunched over a spreadsheet, and knew he was dreading it more. April's budget concerns had prompted Lloyd to look at the winery's figures, revealing things were even tighter than usual at Lacewing Estate. Lucky I didn't accept his offer of financial help after all. Can you go, love? Asked Lloyd. They'll fill me out for another year of sponsorship, and at this stage, I'm not sure we'll be able to deliver. They won't ask you, and Fran's elbow deep in show stuff. Righto, said April. I'll pop in, present the trophy, give vague replies to any queries about future sponsorship, and get out of there the moment the presentations are done. If they hadn't been the major sponsors for the night, she'd be on the couch with ice cream, chocolate, and wine. But they were, and so she went. Parked vehicles spilled out onto the quiet country lane when April arrived at the golf club. Her earlier bravado had disappeared somewhere between her blow-dry and her shonky reverse park, beside a sedan with a "Golf is Life" bumper sticker. She stared at her grim reflection in the rearview mirror. Get in, get it done, and go home. Using her pinky to smudge her hastily applied eyeliner, April applied a fresh coat of lipstick and reached for the trophy she'd be presenting on stage in under an hour. Another thought struck her as she joined the stream of golfers heading towards the club rooms. Have we already paid this year's sponsorship dues, or are they still to come? Not once had she considered whether such donations came out of their account at the start of the financial year or the calendar year. But as April walked towards the clubhouse, she hoped it was the latter. Their ability to support the community would be limited if they couldn't even fund their next team of pruners or pickers, not to mention their next shipment of bottles or printing run of labels. Need a hand? Daniel Winklin emerged from a silver Prado, his crisp shirt and ivory moleskins as impeccable as his car. It's not heavy, she replied, lifting the trophy a little higher and scanning the driveway for slippery stray pebbles. Falling on her bum right at the entrance would be the icing on the cake after the week she'd had. You just don't want Winklin Wines to steal it off Lacewing Estate, right? Daniel's joke fell flat when he saw her face. April had no doubt the Winklins would happily take over the sponsorship gig. There was barely a sporting club in Penwarra without their navy and orange branding plastered across some part of their website, but the good-natured jibe was a little too close to the bone tonight. Where are your folks? Daniel looked behind him, as if he'd somehow missed Lloyd's tall stature, or Fran's silver pixie hairdo amongst the crowd. "Show week," April said. "I'm glad I caught you, though. I wanted to run something past you about Archie's veggie garden." Daniel grimaced. They paused for a trickle of cars merging into the car park. "My little brother's worse than those sheep of his. Never stays where we want him to. I hope he's not too much of a pain in the butt, always coming over to yours." April rushed to reassure him. "He's welcome any time, Dan, really. I just wanted to check if there's space to make a small bed in your dad's garden too, just so Arch doesn't have all his eggs in one basket. He wants to grow a giant pumpkin for next year's show, and I'm not sure I've got the room." Between Dad's obsession with lawn and Felicity's aversion to dirt, they're looking at ripping out what little garden there is and replacing it with turf. They want less garden, not more. Last I heard, they were talking about a rosebush bonfire. April couldn't help but gasp. Not the roses on the side of the conservatory. Although April wasn't a regular visitor to the Winklands' grand home, she'd been there for Archie's birthday party in January. Burning the delicately cupped heritage roses would be criminal. Daniel shrugged. "I guess they're the only flowers on the property. And you know what my stepmother's like. Once she gets something in her mind, she's a hard woman to convince otherwise." April nodded. It was what made Felicity so good at her job as the winery's business manager. "Well, that answers my question about Archie's extra veggie patch. We'll sort something out." She looked around the car park. "Are they here, or did Archie manage to drag your dad to the movies tonight?" "Beats me. The babysitter arrived as I was leaving. Dad and Felicity looked dressed for a cocktail party, not a kid's movie, but I could be wrong." April's heart went out for little Archie. He'd called in after school yesterday, telling her in intricate detail about the movie snacks he'd already picked, the Ninjago t-shirt he'd chosen to match the film, and the session times he'd been poring over all week. A ute pulled up beside them, and April continued inside, leaving Daniel comparing golf handicaps with the newcomer. Archie's disappointment and the budget worries at Lacewing Estate weighed on her mind as she approached the clubrooms. Shifting the trophy onto her hip, April tried to twist the door handle, but whether it was from sweat or the moisturizer she'd lathered on earlier, the door wouldn't budge. "Bugger," she said as the trophy toppled to the ground. "Tell me I haven't just dented the club championship trophy." April closed her eyes and bit her lip as she swooped down to pluck the cup off the path. Phew, no major damage. Breathing a sigh of relief that they wouldn't need to buy a replacement trophy, she brushed off the limestone dust and headed inside. April scanned the room, mentally placing townsfolk, past colleagues and parents of school friends, before landing on a set of sky-blue eyes and white blonde hair she'd been thinking about since January. Even though she'd last seen Connor Jameson in Adelaide, she'd thought of him often. And here he was, sitting in the golf club rooms at Penwarra, like he was one of the locals. The chap on the microphone was settling into another long-winded joke, and Connor was about to make a wager with Fergus about the length of the speeches when the door opened and the piano became the second best thing he'd seen all week. There in the doorway, wearing a daffodil yellow dress with an enormous trophy in her arms, was April Lacey. She was even prettier than he remembered, and from the look of it, she was coming their way. "Connor, what are you doing here?" she whispered breathlessly as she sat the trophy down with a clunk on the table beside him, almost starting a domino of tumbling trophies. They both reached for it at the same time, electricity sparking between them as their hands met. It felt like all the eyes in the room swiveled towards them. A loud shh came from the front. Connor had many questions too, but from the frown on the club president's face and the elbow in the ribs from Fergus, he didn't dare breathe another word until the speech had finished. He recognized a hint of black cherry, the same scent he looked for in a full-bodied Shiraz, when April leaned towards him. "Are you visiting? It's quite the day trip from Rossvale." He shook his head, speaking quickly as a new speaker stepped up to the stage, adjusting the microphone height and slowly unfolding a page of handwritten notes. "No, I've just moved here. The Rossvale job didn't work out." April's eyes lit up, a slow smile building. "Really? That's great news. The speaker cleared her throat and launched into a spiel about the turf rejuvenation program. Connor caught April's eye and thought to himself, moving to Penwarra was definitely a step in the right direction. 10 minutes later, the audience had evidently reached the limit of their interest in turf irrigation issues. Chairs scraped against the floor as people fidgeted. A troop of teenagers in white shirts and black pants hovered at the kitchen door, arms laden with entrees. And Connor spotted a few golfers yawning. The speaker eventually gave up her microphone, looking confused about the enthusiastic applause. A surge of people headed for the bar. "It's great to see you," said April. "Where are you staying?" Connor introduced Fergus, who was gathering up their glasses. "Oh, you're working at Beasley Brothers, right? I heard they had one of the international viddies there. Are you settling in well?" Fergus stepped aside as a waitress arrived with prawns and bruschetta. "Aye, they're a great bunch of people." He gestured to the bar. "I'll just top us up before the next round of presentations start. Can I get you a bevy?" April requested a sparkling red, then turned back to Connor, who felt warm just being in her presence again. "I tried to Insta-stalk you," April said, "but you're not on social media. What type of person isn't on socials?" He laughed. "Nah, I got sick of being heckled by my little sisters for my poor attempts at photography. If my finger wasn't half over the camera, then the lens was filthy, and if the lens wasn't filthy, then the photos were totally rubbish. Sisters, right?" Just then, a man made a beeline towards them, plonking himself down in Fergus's chair. "You're a sight for sore eyes, April, and not just because I need your help at the show," he said, waving to Connor and rushing ahead, barely drawing breath. "Fran said you're making a cake, right?" April nodded. "It mightn't be pretty, and it mightn't even be cooked all the way through, but I'll give it a shot." "Bless you, child, I knew you wouldn't let us down. And you?" The man turned his frenetic energy towards Connor. "You're an unfamiliar face. Where do you fit in?" Connor held out his hand. "I'm Connor Jameson. I've just arrived in town." "Wonderful, brilliant." The man's handshake was as hurried as his words. "I'm Harris O'Brien, head vigneron at Costin and Jankowski Wines, also one of the chief stewards at the local show. You should come. Always a highlight of the year and plenty of room for newcomers. Feel free to enter, too. We could do with some more entries, especially in the baking department." From the corner of his eye, Connor could see April stifling her amusement. Before he could answer, the man sprang out of his chair, waving a hand in the air. "Hold that thought, I've just spotted Brian." He left as quickly as he arrived, determined to garner more bakers between the speeches. But from this brief conversation, plus the warmth of April's greeting and the shared chips with Jean at the bar, Connor felt something that had been sorely lacking at his Rossvale posting. He felt welcome. 5. The entrees were soon cleared, and April was surprised to find the first hour of the night was over. That went quickly, she thought, sneaking another look at Connor. His head was thrown back in laughter, and from the sound of the carefree banter between the two housemates, they seemed to get along well. Connor caught her watching them and leaned an elbow on the table, cupping his chin in his palm. His pale skin had acquired a slight tan in the months since she'd last seen him, making his light hair look even fairer. Scandinavian genetics, perhaps? With his almost white hair and blue eyes, he looked positively Nordic. "You having a good night?" April smiled. "Good wine, good food, good company? I've had plenty of worse Friday nights." Next, it was time for the juniors to receive their trophies. A lengthy process as proud parents snapped endless photos of their golfers with the sponsors and the club president. She'd have to trek up there for her official sponsorship duties soon, too. "I've never won anything like that in my life, but I can imagine if I did, my parents would take even more happy snaps than they are," Fergus said between announcements. A familiar face strode towards their table, and April's intention of giving Jean a stern talking to about the disastrous double date vanished in light of their company. "Hi, Jean," said Fergus, pulling out a chair. Did they know one another? Had Fergus already been added into the local matchmaker's black book? "We're just talking about those snazzy trophies," said Fergus. "Do you have a house full yourself, Jean?"
Trophies? Gosh, not me. But April here regularly scoops the pool at the Penwarra show. Best in class for how many years running?
Jean thrummed her hands on the table in a mock drum roll.
3 years? 5?
April shifted in her seat, mumbling an answer. Sorry? Fergus cupped his ear, leaning in closer. 7, April repeated, taking a large sip of wine. She wanted to tell them the produce convener begged her to enter every year, and she grew the veggies because she loved them, not because she wanted accolades. But if she was completely honest, a small part of her liked the thrill of show day and visiting the produce hall after judging was complete to see if she'd won anything. She couldn't cook to save herself or sew a single button, but she could grow things. Connor caught her eye, as if sensing her reluctance to be in the spotlight. Well, I feel better now, he said. I'm from a family of musicians, and my parents considered a month without a concert or a performance trophy a tragedy. Once my little sister Pippin cooked up a plan to hawk the trophies to buy a new Lego set. He laughed, then launched into a story about a piano recital, his littlest sisters and a family road trip to Cornwall, which had them all in hysterics. He's a concert-level musician? April was impressed. The waitstaff circulated with the mains.
I'll come back later. I don't want to miss my Roo burger,
Jean said, wiggling her fingers and returning to her seat. Fergus told me the food is great here, said Connor, leaning back as the waitress delivered their meals. You both chose the lamb roast, said Fergus, picking up his cutlery to halve his kangaroo burger. I hate to say it, but you're missing the best meal of the night. Connor grimaced. I'm not sure I'll ever get my head around the concept of eating Skippy. You might change your mind after a few months dodging him on the roads, offered Fergus between chews. And it's incredibly delicious, too. Connor cast a doubtful look at Fergus's burger, then tucked into his roast. Man, this food is something else, said Connor. You weren't exaggerating. It gets better, Fergus said, staring wistfully at his empty plate, as if he wanted to lick it clean. The chef, Geraldine Corcoran, is our neighbour and lives on the far side of the golf course. On a good day, you'll smell the food coming out of our kitchen from the 9th hole. I've been entering a raffle for her cooking classes ever since I arrived. They'll send the raffle bucket around the tables after dessert. April's ears pricked up. Her mum, Polly, had given her a voucher for cooking classes last Christmas. But with the rush of summer, the shock of Justin's departure, and the chaos of vintage, none of the classes had lined up with her schedule. You're about to open a bed and breakfast. You should probably shake off this ridiculous phobia of cooking. Which one's Geraldine? She followed Fergus's gesture to the kitchen, spotting a brightly dressed woman beyond the servery window. Her main business is catering with ready-made meals, but she does Friday nights and functions at the golf club, plus the cooking lessons. Although the district was small, April had trouble keeping up with the comings and goings of new residents. It felt like each time she went to the supermarket there were more unfamiliar faces in the aisles. She turned back to find Connor's eyes on her charm bracelet. He reached for the silver charms, his long fingers dwarfing the miniature music notes and instruments. What do you play? Not sure I'd officially call myself a musician, but I pull out the guitar every now and then, April said, turning as the microphone at the front crackled. I'll strum anything, but my playlist's a chock-a-block full of old tunes. What's your weapon of choice? If she had to guess, she'd peg him as a lead guitarist, or maybe a trumpeter. There was something about his presence that deserved centre stage. A memory stirred from the Adelaide conference, but before she could grasp it, or Connor could answer, a voice came over the microphone, asking guests to take their seats. Only a few trophies remained on the table behind them, including the award Lacewing Estate had sponsored for almost 2 decades. April jumped up from her chair. She'd need to move quickly if she wanted to make it to the bathroom and back before the final round of formalities. She applied a fresh coat of lippy, smacked her lips together, and dashed into the loo. The bathroom door opened, letting in a wave of chatter from the clubrooms, along with a conversation that continued as 2 women entered the stalls. First, they bemoaned the lengthy speeches. Then the conversation turned to the wine Lacewing had supplied for the event. April smiled to herself. It was always nice to hear people say good things about Lacewing Estate. and she didn't often have the chance to eavesdrop on a conversation about her father's most recent vintage. But after listening for a moment, her stomach soon sank. I'm not sure how many years Lloyd Lacey's been at the helm, but perhaps it's a few years too many, said the First Lady. It's a nice winery, but they've been putting out the same old varieties for 30 years. They haven't changed with the times. It's just a little... April waited silently to find out what the woman was about to say. Dated? Behind the times? Fusty? None of the words were especially nasty, nor were they officially incorrect, but it still hurt her to hear her father's pride and joy being discussed so flippantly. Stale, that's the word, said the first woman finally. Not bad, not ridiculously expensive or pretentious, just plain old stale. The other lady agreed. It's so sad when the smaller wineries die a slow death. They can't compete with the fresh young businesses, and there's so much history going down the gurgler. Still, you've got to move with the times, right? Maybe if they grew a few more varieties or made a bit more of an effort with their presentation. An indignant heat rushed into April's face. Who was this lady, and how was she in any position to comment? Had she spent years nurturing new vines, risen in the wee hours to register pickers before the sun was scorching and packed last-minute orders at midnight like Lloyd? April wanted to march out of the cubicle and demand to know if this armchair critic had ever worked a day in a vineyard. But instead, she stayed in the cubicle, frozen to the spot. The second lady raised her voice over the sound of flushing cisterns. Straight appeal's half the battle with new customers, isn't it? I mean, the wine's fine, but people probably write it off without tasting it. Fine? Fine? Both ladies stepped out of their stalls, continuing their critique as they washed their hands. A little va-va-voom would go a long way to improving foot traffic. I see the daughter's working on a little accommodation venture, but will it be enough to bring them into the 21st century? What was the name of the winery that folded a few years back? April gulped, her brain finding the answers as the ladies left the bathroom. Millie May Wines had gone into receivership several years ago, and everyone in the district had seen their demise coming from a mile away. The couple who had owned the Millie May Winery had subscribed to the same ideals as her father, intent on making wine the same way their forebears had, relishing the challenge of working the land rather than crunching numbers, with no interest in drastic modernizations or following trends and technical advances. They'd bowed out of the industry with grapes still hanging and unfulfilled sponsorship promises. The wines were eventually ripped out and replaced by the new investors. Was that where Lacewing Estate was heading? Connor savoured every morsel of his Black Forest cake, and from the rapid rate Fergus gobbled down the lemon tart, it was obviously a winner too. I better buy myself some raffle tickets, Connor said, noticing the chef emerging from the kitchen with a bright yellow bucket. Wallets were opened and banknotes were exchanged for raffle tickets. When it came around to their table, Connor and Fergus bought 5 each. Geraldine, meet your new neighbour, Fergus said, introducing them both. Connor here just moved into my spare room. He's looking for a job at one of the wineries. Geraldine beamed as she handed them their tickets. Pleasure meeting you. Do call in if you need anything. My place is the next best thing to a supermarket. Save you driving into town. The kind offer was unexpected. I'm even more useless in the kitchen than Fergus. At least he can manage eggs without burning the house down. My specialty is toast. But if I run out of bread, I'll keep it in mind. Thanks. Geraldine's face twisted, like the concept caused her physical pain. Well then, as a welcome to the neighbourhood, I'll toss in a few extra entries for the raffle, she said, ripping off 2 more tickets and handing them over. It sounds like you need the cooking classes more than most. And I'll keep an ear to the ground about any winery jobs. Connor thanked her, and as Geraldine left, he scanned the room for April. He should be asking her about potential job vacancies, and yet another question was on the tip of his tongue. She'd come to the event alone. Did that mean she was single? And if so, would she now agree to that drink they'd talked about in Adelaide? He flexed his ankle one way, then the other, the twinge in his leg jolting his thoughts back to the UK, and the heartache he was determined to put behind him. Connor checked his smartwatch, relieved there were no new emails or missed phone calls from international numbers. His ex-fiancée Phoebe hadn't understood the ebb and flow of a winery, and she hadn't liked jazz much either. But she'd been a constant in his life for so many years. He'd lost count of their breakups and makeups. But this time it was different. This time he'd been the one to end things. The club president stepped up to the microphone. "This should be the last gong," Fergus said, mistaking Connor's restlessness for impatience, but everyone usually kicks on for a few hours afterwards. "Nobody knows how to party like a bunch of boomers at a sports function," he chuckled. The bathroom door clanged, and he watched April conferring with the club president before striding to the trophy table and collecting the trophy. With her bright dress and smooth legs, she didn't need a microphone or trophy to grab the room's attention. But now, watching April studying her shoes as she was introduced, Connor thought her smile seemed a little forced. He fought the urge to step up beside her and take her hand. "You barely know her," he reminded himself.
"Excuse me, coming through?"
said a familiar voice, and he twisted in his seat to see Jean squeezing between the chairs towards them. She took April's chair.
"Like a deer in the headlights, isn't she?"
Jean whispered, nodding to the stage.
"Much prefers her vines and her veggie patch to the spotlight, but she's a smart cookie and a hard worker. Single, too, in case you were wondering."
Single. Connor reined in his reaction to this news, keenly aware of the older lady's watchful gaze. On stage, April was fumbling in the pocket of her yellow dress, and time slowed as she tried to open a folded sheet of paper while juggling the trophy. "She's going to drop it. I think somebody should give her a hand up there," Connor said, sliding out of his chair and skirting around the now empty trophy table. As he stepped onto the stage, April gave him a grateful look, relinquishing the trophy. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. "Thanks," she whispered, sitting her typed speech on the lectern and angling the mic to better suit her short stature. Once she had everything under control, Connor handed the trophy back and retreated to his seat.
"A gentleman, too,"
Connor heard the old lady murmur to Fergus as he paused by their table before continuing to the bar. He had a feeling it would be safer than sitting beside Jean. April's voice was shaky with nerves as she began her speech. "Why did I let myself get roped into this?" Fran was the pro at schmoozing and sponsorship gigs, and while her dad wasn't exactly charming on stage, he at least had the advantage of experience. Butterflies swooped around in April's stomach. The wine hadn't helped. If anything, it had made her feel more scatty, especially combined with the surprise of seeing Connor and the knowledge there were rumours flying around town about Lacewing Estate. All the more reason to nail this, she told herself. "Tonight, I'm proud to be handing over the major award at the Penwarra Golf Club. I heard the Kalangadoo golfers put up a great fight in the pennant championship today, so commiserations to them, and congratulations to our players from Penwarra." She wiped a sweaty hand on her dress before continuing. "For those who don't know me, I'm April Lacey, standing here on behalf of Lacewing Estate. In fact, the wine many of you are enjoying tonight is from my father's 2020 vintage, and we hope you like it as much as we do." April caught sight of dozens of golfers, including Dan, at the back of the room, raising their glasses in her direction. There was a lot of love in the town for Lacewing Estate. That wasn't something anyone, not even the knockers, could take away from them. "We might not be the fanciest winery in the district," she continued, her voice getting stronger and her confidence building. "Our cellar door and tasting room were built by my father and grandfather 40 years ago, and they've poured their hearts into the wines and the vines over the years. We have a proud history, and our customers are like family to us. Without this passion, we wouldn't be here tonight, and perhaps we mightn't have been able to sponsor quite so many trophies like this whopper." There was a round of applause as she presented the trophy to the winning team, and as she looked around the room, April knew she needed to help her father keep their doors open. "Thank God that's over," she said, barely breaking stride as she collected her handbag from the table and sat down beside Connor at the bar. "Are you hiding from Jean too?" He nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. I can't believe Fergus didn't warn me. She's a force to be reckoned with." "Is she always so nosy?" she offered. "Meddlesome?" Connor smothered a grin. "I was going to say intense. Great speech, by the way. Another sparkling. I've heard it's from an outstanding winery. In fact, I've just had the full rundown on your strengths from Jean." April groaned. "Jean has no shame. You should see her in the lead up to Valentine's Day. Or even better, if you do see her, quickly turn around and run in the other direction, or you'll find yourself dating one of her many nieces, nephews, grandchildren, or neighbours. My housemate, Lauren, has been sucked into her matchmaking schemes half a dozen times, but I'm steering well clear from now on." As much as she had enjoyed Connor's company tonight, she felt the weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders and wanted to get back to the winery. The women in the bathroom were correct. If Lacewing Estate was going to have any chance of thriving, they needed to change things. "I have to head off, but I'll see you again soon, yeah? I'd love to pick your brain about marketing." "Count me in," he said with an easy grin. It might have been the adrenaline, or just plain instinct, but without thinking it through, April leaned over and kissed his cheek before making for the door. God, why did I do that? It's like taking out one of those stupid billboards and telling all of Penwarra that I've got a thing for the new winemaker in town. She felt more eyes on her on the way out than she had on the way in, which was saying something. Mortified by her faux pas, she nearly collided with Daniel, who was pulling his phone from his pocket outside the golf club entrance. "Jean'll have a field day with that," said Dan, nodding back into the club rooms. "You know she doesn't need any encouragement, especially with a hottie like Connor." April waved away Daniel's teasing tone. She liked Connor, and he was certainly a better match than Jean's blind double date, but was she really ready to get back on the horse? That would be a conversation for another day. Right now, she had more pressing things on her mind, like helping her father bring Lacewing Estate into the new century without wounding his pride. Her ute beeped as she pressed the key fob. "I've got to run. Have a good one." "I'll try." Daniel glanced at his phone with a grin, probably in the middle of digital matchmaking. "I'll see you at the show next weekend, right?" "It'll be hard to miss me. Just look for the lady wheelbarrowing veggies into the produce hall. I'm hoping your little brother gets a few ribbons too. Surely they'll give all the primary school kids a participation ribbon. He'll be crying into his fairy floss if not." Connor watched April leave, then quickly pulled Google Maps up on his phone, checking Lacewing Estate's location in relation to his new digs. According to the app, it was a 5-minute drive or an hour's walk from the golf club, which sounded like a pretty easy stroll compared to the distance between wineries in England. Although the wine industry was one of the fastest growing agricultural sectors in the UK, the British weather rarely lent itself to leisurely strolls between vineyards. He returned to the table with 2 fresh pints, finding Fergus with a smug look on his face. "Wait till you see the magic trick I've just pulled for you," Fergus winked, then confirmed that April was gone before hoeing into her untouched lemon tart. Magic trick? Fergus wouldn't elaborate, and it wasn't until the speeches resumed that Connor understood what on earth he was talking about. "We're almost done here," said Barney Anderson, the golf club president, from the front of the room. "I just want to draw your attention to a few newcomers tonight." The club president gestured to Fergus and Connor. "Raise your hand, lads, so everyone can get eyeballs on you." They dutifully lifted their arms as they were introduced. "We all know our local winemakers are our biggest supporters, so on behalf of the town, let's give them a warm welcome. I've also heard on the grapevine—" Barney paused, a smile on his face as he listened to the groans and cheap laughs ripple through the room. "That young Connor here is a qualified piano teacher with a background in performance, and that he'll be taking bookings for lessons. He's also after a job in one of our local wineries, so spread the word, folks. And if we're extra lucky, maybe we can convince him to tickle the ivories for us sometime." Connor whipped around to see the smug look still on Fergus's face. "You can thank me later," Fergus said through his mouthful of dessert. "I don't even have a piano," Connor said, uncomfortable that the information had been shared when he'd barely unpacked his suitcase or arranged a job, let alone printed new business cards. And then there was the small matter of performing, or more to the point, his lack of performing since the accident. He'd only shared the information to take the attention off April, who'd faltered under Jean's laser focus. Minor details, said Fergus, nudging him with an elbow. I was chatting with the lovely lass at the bar, and she reckons they'd be happy to see this one back in use. Bit of a tune-up and you'll be sorted. The volume of conversations ramped up the moment the president stepped down from the microphone. Connor rose quickly, keen to catch Barney and check that it was officially okay to use the Yamaha piano hiding under the linen sheet. The last thing he wanted was the town thinking he was taking liberties with their musical instrument. April's yellow dress appeared in his mind. Or taking liberties with the local women. 6. April shook 2 Barocca tablets from the canister the next morning and placed them on a tray with a glass of water. Lauren's bedroom smelled like the bottom of a wine vat, and the precautionary bucket by her bedside table didn't bode well either. Why didn't somebody stop me drinking a whole bottle of champagne? Lauren groaned, tossing an arm over her eyes. Ah, the perils of youth. Old enough to know better, but young enough to do it again. And unless you were buying the fancy French stuff, I think you mean sparkling wine. Lauren started shaking her head before realizing it made the hangover worse and settling on grimacing. Same, but even the alcohol wasn't enough to salvage my Tinder date. It was terrible. From now on, Lauren said, tossing the Baroccas into the water and watching them fizz, I'm only dating younger blokes who aren't as likely to mention their brood of children halfway through dessert. It was going great until then, but I'm not old enough to be a stepmom. Well, if he was prepared to leave that level of detail out of his profile, you wouldn't want to touch him with a 10-foot barge pole anyway. True, Lauren said, sipping the drink cautiously. Or maybe I need to resort to Jean's matchmaking services again. Or just give up on finding a single bloke who's in his 30s without a bucket load of baggage or a gaggle of kids. She shuddered theatrically, then groaned again. Oh, my brain feels like it's in a blender when I do that. I'll let Jane know. She'll be here in a jiffy. April grinned, pulling her short dark hair into a stumpy ponytail. Don't you dare. At least not until I've recovered from last night. Oh, I'm never drinking again, said Lauren, giving her a sharp side-eye. Was the trophy presentation as bad as you expected? April shook her head. I'll explain over brekkie. Can you stomach toast? She returned to the kitchen and whisked 2 thick slices of sourdough from the toaster before slathering them with butter and jam, then perched on the edge of her friend's bed with a plate of her own and explained about the renovation's budget blowout, Connor's surprise arrival, and the conversation she'd overheard in the toilets. Dad loves it, he really does. But if they want something to retire on, they'll need to shake things up a bit. My little B&B will be good for tourism, but I get the feeling we need a few more irons in the fire. And you're the one breaking that news to Lloyd? Lauren nibbled her toast doubtfully. Softly. April thought of Connor and the idea that had been brewing in her mind overnight. Dad's not brilliant with change. But if I can bake a cake for Fran's show tables, the least he can do is consider a few new options. She'd been both disappointed and relieved that the lights had been out at Lloyd and Fran's mud brick house when she'd arrived home last night. But in fact, it had worked out well. After spending the evening poring over Stephanie Scowler's best-selling marketing books, April felt better prepared for the conversation they needed to have. It might be madness, but I can't not say anything, April said. I've gone over my notes from the Adelaide conference. I'm totally across the food tourism program and the opportunities with Destination SA, and I'll convince Dad to give Lacewing Estate a freshen up, even if I have to die trying. Good luck, Lauren said, stretching out in her bed. April gathered her phone and notebook, determination fueling her stride. I hope your dad's had a coffee before you march in there, Lauren added. Last I heard, Lloyd thought marketing and makeovers were wanky, airy-fairy nonsense. His words, not mine. April laughed. She'd heard him use the same terms more than once. He doesn't have much choice. He mightn't like it, but what else are we going to do? Halfway down the laneway to the winery, she stopped to admire the beauty of their vineyard in the morning light. The dew glinting off the grassy rows, and the vines still majestic as the last of the foliage embraced the rich tones of autumn. Could she pull it off? Anything had felt possible when she stood on the stage last night, with the golfers raising a toast to Lacewing Estate. But now, in the bright light of morning, doubt nipped at her heels. April looked at the stables to her left. She'd poured her money and heart into the B&B, but it was just part of her plan for the winery, not the linchpin. A kookaburra swooped down from the gum tree, intent on the long grass by Gordon's trailer, and emerged with a wriggling lizard. In the blink of an eye, the bird returned to its nest in the hollow, and the lizard disappeared, likely a meal for hungry chicks. Mishka nuzzled her hand, as if unsure why they'd paused. April continued walking. Small, flagging wineries couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. If she didn't encourage her dad to act now, it might be too late.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
Connor tossed a load of laundry into the washing machine and set out for the town centre, keen to explore his new surrounds. While he'd been unprepared for Barney's announcement at last night's function, Connor had left the golf club with more than 5 potential bookings. One of the trophy winners, who was also a local principal, had assured him there would be a flurry of interest when she put a note in the primary school newsletter. So that was his side hustle sorted. Now he just needed to find a day job. He took the main street slowly, parking at the far end and exploring on foot. Awnings overhung the footpath, and Connor peered into shop windows, getting a sense of the rural town and the local businesses servicing the small population. The scent of pastry and warm bread lured him to the bakery at the end of the street, and as he waited for the steady stream of customers to breeze in and out of the doors, he spotted a community notice board. Connor photographed 2 promising notices, then headed inside, his mouth watering at the display. "How does anyone choose?" he asked with a smile. The bemused bakery worker glanced from the sultana-studded, sugar-coated cream buns to the wedges of assorted slices and savoury scrolls. "One of each," she quipped with a laugh, "but if you're into moderation, you can't go wrong with a snot block." A snot block? What type of food did the establishment stock out the back? And why would anyone choose something so indelicately named when they could have a cinnamon scroll, jelly cake, or bee sting slice? She pointed to the tray underneath the cash register. "The snobs call it vanilla slice, but either way, it's the most popular item on the menu. You a tourist?" Connor nodded, then shook his head. "Not for long, I hope. I've just moved here," he offered, pulling out his wallet. "A black coffee, please. And I've not yet tried vanilla slice, but when in Rome, right?" She nodded, pleased with his decision, and pulled not 1 but 2 slices from the glass-fronted cabinet. "How about 2 for 1 as a welcome-to-town deal? And next time you're in, I want to hear whether you prefer traditional or French vanilla." Connor promised to report back. Taking a seat at the outdoor table, he studied the generous slices, which looked to be custard sandwiched between layers of flaky pastry and topped with a glossy icing. One filling was butter yellow, while the other was a delicate creamy colour. His phone rang as he deliberated on which he liked best. April's voice on the other end caught him by surprise, but what she said surprised him even more. "An assistant winemaker? Yeah, I'd love to come for a look," he said, brushing crumbs from his polo shirt and jotting down the address. "Riverley Lane. This sounds random, but I don't suppose you have a little brother called Archie? I'm already heading your way at 2 p.m. "He's my neighbour," she explained. "Remember Dan, who you met in Adelaide? It's his half-brother." "Cool," said Connor. "That works out perfectly. I'll see you afterwards." Connor paused outside Lacewing Estate as he drove to meet his first prospective student, Archie. There was a stark difference between the 2 neighbouring properties. Winklin Wines boasted imposing stone gates, a tree-lined entrance, and a glass-fronted winery. In contrast, Lacewing looked distinctly down at heel, with a humble cellar door, dusty parking area, and tired landscaping. He could imagine which winery received the most foot traffic, and with a stab of guilt, knew which one he would have chosen if he was judging strictly on appearance. He continued down the lane to the Winklins' home, and a few moments later was sitting in a magnificent glass conservatory with Rupert Winklin. "I've never met a winemaking piano teacher before. What do you teach?" "It's not the most common career combination," Connor agreed. "Mostly primary students, but I've taught adults too. Classical, modern, jazz, I love it all. What's your son interested in?" "Depends what day of the week you ask him," Rupert said, smoothing his silver hair. "Archie's a gifted child. He took a shine to the piano, but he's barely touched it since his last teacher moved interstate. I've tried, but..." He lifted his hands in the air and shook his head. "Archie always responds better to someone else pulling him into line. I don't want him throwing away his talent. I can't promise anything, but I'd certainly like to meet him and see what he's capable of. Is he here?" Connor was pretty sure he would have noticed a 10-year-old child by now, but he glanced around the room anyway. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by the sound of footsteps on the terrazzo tiles.
Dad, you should have come to the movies. It was awesome. You need to come next time. Even Mum liked.
A gangly-limbed, freckle-faced boy skidded to a halt at the sight of them.
Who are you?
Connor stifled a grin. "You must be Archie. I'm Connor, and from what your dad's told me, I might be your new piano teacher." Archie's little mouth twitched as he mulled over the information.
"But you're not old enough to be a teacher. Mrs. Damhouse was as old as the hills, even older than Dad."
Rupert coughed, his heavy grey eyebrows furrowing. Connor guessed that Rupert was probably half a century older than his son. A lady closer to Connor's age than Rupert's joined them. Rupert's second wife, Connor suspected. "Manners, Archie," she said, introducing herself as Archie's mother, Felicity Winklin. She stayed only a moment before disappearing into the cavernous house. Rupert ushered him and Archie into the piano room. Library was a more accurate description, thought Connor, looking at the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the sliding ladder with wheels at the bottom. A glossy piano took centre stage in the middle of the floor. What a home. It only took a few moments to establish that Archie had a keen ear for music. Connor suspected he'd make steady progress with the right guidance. "I'm happy to go ahead if you both are." Rupert pulled out his phone and checked his calendar for the best afternoon to begin the lessons, while Archie looked a little less certain.
"Do you smack people's fingers with a ruler?"
"Of course not," replied Connor.
"Will you make me practice all the boring exercises every single lesson?"
"Depends what they are. Possibly."
"Do you give out lollies for extra good kids?"
Leaning against the piano, Connor considered this for a moment. "Occasionally. If they've worked hard, made a solid improvement. Certainly not each lesson, though."
"Okay. This is the most important question, and if you get it wrong, I'm not gonna be happy."
Connor smothered a laugh. Archie would get on famously with Nell and Pippin, he thought, bracing himself for the deciding question. April strode into the winery after lunch, hoping her father hadn't done a backflip on everything they'd discussed this morning. "The position's still vacant," she reminded him, "and you said it would be a perfect opportunity for the right person." Lloyd grumbled and fussed with the wine order he was packing. April lifted an eyebrow. He used the early harvest as the excuse for not hiring someone the moment Justin left, but now she got the feeling her father wasn't being entirely honest. "You weren't thinking I'd step into the role?" He taped the box, giving a non-committal shrug. "You arrived home from that Adelaide conference more jazzed about Lacewing Estate than I'd seen you in a long time. I wanted to leave space in case..." Lloyd paused. "Would it be such a bad thing? You're invaluable during harvest, and one day this will be all yours." "Dad," she said gently, "we tried that, and it worked for all of about 2 months. I love Lacewing, but I'm a mighty fine horticulturalist. This is your winery, and you can run it however you like." It's our winery, he said, leaning in. Always has been. She smiled and slotted the invoice into the packing label before passing it to her father. Even so, I'll stick with lending a hand when and where I can. You need someone who can tell a Shiraz from a Cabernet at 100 paces and know exactly what's missing from a blend. I just don't have the winemaker genes, not like you. Connor seemed to know what he was talking about. I'll see what he's like in person, but I'm not making any promises, said Lloyd. I'm not interested in someone barging their way in here and telling me how to run things. He might be a dill like that Justin fella, and if that's the case, we're better off ambling along the way we are. Ambling was the right word, thought April, looking at the dark timber trim and the terracotta tiles. It was in dire need of an overhaul. Lloyd cleared his throat. And I've thought on your suggestions about using your long service leave to spruce the place up. April's ears pricked up at those words. And? She tried not to sound too eager. You don't want to waste your time off on something like that, Lloyd said, shooting her a smile as he packed more wine bottles into a second box. You should be sunning yourself in Bali or skiing in New Zealand, not fussing about filling in potholes or whatever else you think needs doing around here. Our customers don't worry about little things like that. April thought otherwise, and she told him as much when they'd spoken this morning, but she knew better than to push. Ensuring the meeting with Connor went smoothly was the first hurdle. Then she'd begin drawing up a list of improvements and presenting Lloyd with a watertight marketing plan. Softly, softly. I'm just thinking of freshen up, not a drastic refurbishment, she said, running her finger through the dust that had settled on a bottle. I'll be working on bright, clean lines in the B&B, so why not factor in a little extra paint to give this place a lift? And I've made up my mind about my long service leave. I'm already looking forward to 8 glorious weeks here in Penwara, helping Gordon finish off the stable. April beamed. Who needs to be a jet-setter when you can be a go-getter, right? Lloyd sighed, but she could tell his heart wasn't in it. You know I don't like it when you use my sayings against me. I should start writing them down, she teased, heading out through the tasting room as her stepmother came through the door. Hey, Franny, how's it going with the show entries? With a groan, Fran unloaded an armful of paperwork onto the long timber bar that was meant for wine tastings, but spent half the time being used as a desk. April added another thing to her mental list of winery upgrades. Creating a designated workspace for Fran's admin duties would free up the far end of the bar for its official purpose. I've had a trickle of registrations over the weekend, but it's slow going. I wonder if this Connor is much of a cook. It'd be a tragedy to have only 1 or 2 entries in the blokes' cooking section. A tragedy, repeated April, trying to keep a straight face. He'll be here shortly. How about we quiz him then? I've got a spare show program here somewhere. Fran rummaged through her paperwork, then opened and shut drawers on the other side of the bench, becoming more flustered by the minute. Fran had been bothered by the golf ladies gossiping. But, April reasoned, surely it was better they knew the town was speculating on Lacewing's future. She put a hand on Fran's arm. I've got one at my place, she offered, and I've got a few errands to do at the stables before Gordon leaves. I'll bring the program back with me. Connor wasn't sure what type of question Archie was about to lob his way, but from the earnest look on the young boy's face, it was evidently important. Archie's father had been keen for twice-weekly lessons, but it wasn't just the regular income that made Connor want to answer it correctly. He'd worked with hundreds of young pianists over the years, and he knew Archie's natural gift for music would make him a joy to work with. Go on then, Connor said. Hit me with it. Archie folded his arms across his chest. What's better, cats or dogs or sheep? Connor considered this carefully, suspecting his answer would be a deal-breaker. There hadn't been signs of any animals in the immaculate household, no half-chewed shoes or scratching posts, and he'd been so busy admiring the grand home and extensive vineyards that he'd failed to look at the paddocks beyond the house. No clues there. Connor looked at Rupert, who was intent on his phone, and then back at Archie, just in time to see him glance in the direction of Lacewing Estate. He recalled the golden retriever April had spoken about in Armadale. Dogs first, Connor said firmly, then sheep, and then cats. Archie's face lit up, confirming he'd passed the all-important test. And although he'd only come to introduce himself and discuss lesson timetables, Connor soon found himself leaning against a fence post as Archie rattled off the names of his pet lambs.
That ram lamb is AJ, the small ewe lamb is Spice, and there's her twin, Sugar.
Connor followed the boy's outstretched arm, observing the livestock. He'd only dealt with the end result, when it was roasted or presented as a herb-crusted rack at a restaurant, and couldn't differentiate the ewes from the rams. Are they friendly? Archie shielded his eyes with a hand, squinting.
Sometimes. If you have a bucket of lamb pellets, they're extra friendly, but most of the time they're more interested in grazing than patting. Can you see 2 more lambs?
Connor scanned the grassy paddock. They could be sleeping or hiding behind the big trees, he suggested. But the boy frowned and looked over his shoulder at the main house. His father, Rupert, had his back turned, making a phone call.
How good are you at catching sheep?
Archie asked in an undertone. Connor spluttered. Me? Archie nodded sagely.
Yeah, we need to get Barbara and Marty back in the paddock before Dad notices they're out again.
He tipped his head to Lacewing Estate.
And before they eat April's grapes. Or worse, the veggie garden.
Without waiting for a response, the boy jogged across the narrow limestone road that divided the 2 properties. Connor wasn't sure about the intricacies of sheep herding either, but he acknowledged it would be easier with 2 people. I'm not sure I'll be much help, he said, quickly catching up to Archie. Last time I went near a sheep, it was a petting zoo at a school fair and the thing bit me. Archie giggled, shaking his head.
Just help me sneak up on them, and then when you get close enough, grab one and toss it over your shoulder like a sack of wheat.
Connor didn't have the heart to tell Archie that although he'd lugged plenty of wine barrels and musical instrument cases, his experience with sacks of wheat were on par with his shepherding skills. They found the 2 lambs gorging themselves on the fresh grass between the gold and red-leafed vines. But despite their fuzzy, innocent faces and contented grazing, the sheep moved like greyhounds when they spotted Archie and Connor. After 5 minutes of zipping between vines and getting no closer than an arm's length, Archie reconsidered his plan.
You can't go straight behind them, Connie. You have to kind of sneak up on them, fool them into thinking you're going one way, and then grab them from the side. Like a footy tackle, you know? Only gentler. We don't want to hurt them.
I was never much good at rugby, Connor admitted. Wiping a trickle of sweat off his forehead, Connor wondered how long it would be before Rupert realised they were messing. We might be better off asking your dad for help.
No!
Archie's vehemence was clear, and Connor sensed the boy would rather spend all day trying to catch the lambs himself than involve his father. Was it smart getting between the 2 Winklins before the first piano lesson had even started? Probably not, but looking at the scowl on Archie's face, he figured the boy must have his reasons. This is April's winery, right? Connor asked. Does she know how to catch sheep? Archie nodded, relief crossing his face.
She's much better than you,
Archie assured him, turning on his heel and loping away. A quaint cottage was nestled on a grassy plot amongst the vineyards. With its simple, peaked roof and freestone paddock rock walls, it looked like it had been built by convict settlers. Archie knocked on the door and April emerged, followed closely by a shaggy golden retriever.
Mishka!
Archie called, then explained the problem to April as he fawned over the dog. Connor, said April, stepping onto the veranda decking. We're not expecting you yet. And how on earth did you get roped into sheep wrangling? Connor grinned. She looked just as good in cut-off denim shorts, a polo shirt, and with messy hair as she did dolled up in a dress and heels. Right place, right time, I guess, he said with a shrug. Oh boy, Barbara will be going on the barbecue at this rate. I'll grab my boots, she said, pulling a baseball cap over her hair. Mishka rushed over from Archie to greet Connor, blithely ignoring April's whistle. Can you grab her, Connor? Said April. Mishka's not much help when it comes to rounding up sheep. I know how you feel, old girl. He kneeled down to greet the friendly dog while April hurried over with the lead. With Mishka tied to a veranda post, they went in search of the lambs. Connor was surprised how easy they were to capture with an extra set of hands.
Man, they've been pigging out big time,
said Archie, grimacing as he lifted one of the lambs. Connor looked between April and Archie. They'd each slung a sheep over their shoulders with practiced ease, but the animals couldn't be especially light with those bulging bellies. Want a hand? I'm fine, said April.
Me too,
Archie panted. Connor offered his assistance again when Archie stopped for a breather 100 metres later.
They're heavier than they look,
the boy admitted, handing Connor the woolly escape artist. Connor tensed as the animal quivered, struggling against him. But it settled once he'd tucked it over his shoulder as April had. The sheep even rested its head against the back of Connor's head, as if finally resigned to being ferried home. I thought that hair would be wiry, he said, stroking Marty's coat.
Wool,
Archie corrected. You should snuggle them when they're a few weeks old, said April, opening the gate to the Winklands paddock, softer than a brand new pair of Ugg boots. Just like putting kangaroo on the menu, Connor wasn't sure how he felt about the living, breathing creature he was holding being turned into footwear. But you've named them. Aren't they pets? Let's just say they're multi-purpose, April said, noticing his conflicted expression. You're in the country now, Connor, and we grow some of the best food and fibres here in the Limestone Coast. You'll get used to it. Connor and April set the lambs down, watching them hurtle across the paddock to rejoin their mates. Archie piped up.
Are you letting Connor start a veggie patch too, April?
I've got enough trouble with you in my veggie patch, she said, ruffling Archie's hair. Connor might help my dad with some winery stuff. She caught Connor's eye, and he could see her hesitate. And if you're still happy to hand over a few of your marketing tips, I'll happily soak up all your hints. It doesn't have to be now, she hurried to add. But from the look on her face, Connor could tell she hoped it would be sooner rather than later. I think we're done here, right, Archie? The boy opened his mouth to protest as Rupert Winkland rounded the corner. I was wondering where in the blazes everyone went to, Rupert said, then pointed at Archie. You've got 2 minutes to change into something smarter before we leave for Robe. Connor wasn't sure where Robe was, but from the look on Archie's face, it wasn't as much fun as the prospect of an afternoon at April's place. He looked completely glum as Rupert led him back inside. Now that the sheep herding's done for the day, I'm wide open until 2 p.m, Connor said to April with a laugh. Does now work? She nodded eagerly. 7. Wiping his feet on the doormat, Connor instinctively ducked as he walked inside April's home. This isn't one of those English buildings with the hobbit-height doorways, you know, she quipped. He returned her grin. Thank God for that. I have a constant crick in my neck from ducking under doorways back home. April's place was cosy but bright. Unlike his golf course digs, which was full of functional but mismatched furniture, April's soft green couch was covered with cushions that matched the fabric of the curtains, and there were houseplants in nearly every corner of the timber-floored living room. Nice place, he said, setting his keys and phone on a scrubbed oak dining table and turning his attention to the boisterous retriever prancing around at his feet. And you're a friendly pooch, aren't you? He said, laughing as Mishka flipped onto her back and offered her belly up for a rub. Thanks. It's not huge, but I love it. And Mishka's completely shameless when it comes to visitors, said April. She hooked her finger towards the arched doorway beside the kitchen. Bathroom's in there if you want to wash up. The pot plants continued along the hallway to the bathroom, where a huge maidenhair fern dangled from the ceiling above a corner spa bath, and the tiles looked like something from his grandmother's house, with tiny bunches of grapes on every third tile. Connor washed his hands with citrus-scented hand soap, then walked back out to the kitchen. So, this is part of your family's estate? He asked, leaning against the bench. April nodded, pulling glasses from a cupboard. This was the original winemaker's residency, back when the first vines were planted. It's been a guest house, a storage shed, and back in the 40s it housed an Italian prisoner of war. April sounded so proud of these historical facts that Connor didn't mention that the stone walls in Derbyshire dated back centuries. Really? A wet nose nudged his leg, and even though he'd just washed his hands, Connor found himself stroking the dog's velvety ears again. April carried a jug of iced water over to the dining table and placed it between a notepad, laptop, and vase of eucalyptus leaves. Connor sat across from her and listened as she outlined her ideas for the winery. April had been keen to soak up information at the city conference, but it felt like something more was driving her now. She pressed him for feedback, welcoming his suggestions and quickly noting down the websites and blogs he recommended. If I'd known you were a marketing boffin, I would have made an appointment with you at the Adelaide conference, instead of spending my money on the whiz-bang consultation, April said. He laughed. I'm not a guru, but I like putting this part of my uni degree to good use, he replied. Most of the winemakers followed straight science and agriculture modules, but I sneaked in as many tourism and sales tutorials as I could. So far, it's proved pretty helpful. The Kiwi winery was happy to let me work with their marketing person, and they were in the middle of cost-conscious rebranding. So it was all about making the most of local opportunities and using a shoestring budget to improve what they had. That's music to my ears, she said, scribbling down a few more of his suggestions. Oh, I wish I could plug you into my laptop and download all your tips right now, but Dad's expecting us. I don't mind coming back afterwards, Connor offered, holding her gaze. She looked away to clip the lead on Mishka, then fixed him with a grin. Are you flirting with me, Connor Jameson? He raised an eyebrow, so his expression mirrored hers. I'm not sure that'd be the smartest idea, given I'm about to walk into a job interview with your father, and I really do need a job. Unless, of course, you thought it might work in my favour. Connor spread his hands and shrugged, feigning nonchalance. In which case, I could certainly rise to the challenge. He couldn't interpret the fleeting expression that crossed April's face. Too forward, perhaps. Trust me, she chuckled, giving a shake of her head. It probably wouldn't be the most strategic move right now. But there was something about the way she said it, and the wistful glance his way, that contradicted her words. Right now. They strolled across to the winery, pausing at the building April was renovating for her bed and breakfast. It's a beauty, said Connor. Made from the same paddock rock as your home. Yep, April said proudly. It's got a long way to go before it's ready for guests, but I'm thrilled with how it's come up so far. And while the cellar door and tasting room weren't in the same state as the old stables, Connor immediately saw why April was pushing for an overhaul. The facilities were tidy and the equipment looked well maintained, but the front of house areas had a tiredness that suggested first impressions weren't a priority. April's father strode over from a tasting room. Lloyd Lacey, nice to meet you. Connor shook his hand, quickly discovering Lloyd was extremely proud of his daughter and his wines. Fran Lacey rushed in half an hour later, greeting Connor with an unusual and completely unexpected request. Nobody's ever asked me to bake a cake before, Connor laughed, and if you could see me trying to cook, you'd probably understand why. Fran wasn't deterred. I don't care if it's got lumps in the batter or the odd bit of browning on the sides. I just need plates on tables, she insisted. Please? Sensing this was almost as much of a deal-breaker as Archie's earlier question about dogs versus cats, Connor found himself agreeing. What's the worst that could happen? He left with a show program, an entry form, and a job at Lacewing Estate. You made a good impression on Dad, April said, pointing out the different vines as they walked back to her place. He's a bit stuck in his ways, but he loves his wine and treats both his customers and his staff like family. Sounds way better than my last boss in Rossvale. There's something to be said for predictability. Though this cooking business might be a bit of a clanger, I really can't cook to save myself. Me neither, said April. In fact, it's a sign of exactly how desperate they are that Fran even asked me to enter. Whatever you cook would have to be completely black and inedible to beat the mess I'll be plating up. I take my hat off to anyone who can pull off a proper dish, said Connor. All my mates think they're the next Jamie Oliver or Heston Blumenthal. But I'd rather teach piano chords to a 6-year-old than attempt a roast dinner. I mean, the timing, for starters. How does anyone get the peas done at the same time as the potatoes? Not to mention the gravy. April lifted her face to the sky. She seemed delighted to find another non-cook. Finally, someone who speaks my language. And I don't know about the UK, but a leg of lamb is too pricey to risk in the hands of an amateur. I'd rather sink $30 into a cheese board than risk burning a roast. Or worse, giving myself food poisoning because it isn't cooked enough. My mum, Polly, actually bought me a voucher for cooking classes for Christmas after I had a little cooking mishap involving a fry pan and a fire extinguisher. They arrived at April's house, and Connor leaned against the veranda post, studying her. And how were they? The classes or the fry pan? April grinned. The pan went in the bin, and I haven't taken the classes yet. I'm sure it'll be a room full of tragic widowers and bachelors, old guys who are only just learning to cook because their wife or mum died, right? And bored housewives who want to be the next Donna Hay. I've never been called tragic before. I purchased tickets in the raffle for the cooking classes with Geraldine. It's being drawn at the show, and I'm terribly tempted to buy extra tickets between now and then. Stop it, she said, raising an eyebrow cheekily. Piano playing, cake baking, sheep wrangling, and now raffles. You're a dark horse, Connor Jameson. And as he followed her inside, Connor found he was already trying to think up new ways to make her smile like that again. April pulled a bottle of Chardonnay from the fridge, poured 2 generous glasses, and found a packet of white chocolate Tim Tams in the freezer. She set them on the table on the veranda in front of Connor. It was the least she could do after picking his brains about marketing. Plus, she liked that things hadn't gotten awkward after she'd put the kibosh on them dating. She wasn't ready for romance again, not after Justin. There was nothing unprofessional about talking marketing strategies with the new winemaker over a glass of wine, not when she was in her daggy weekend clothes, smelling like lanolin and without a hint of makeup. Was there? Now, this isn't a traditional pairing, she said, gesturing at the table, but I'm ready for a sugar hit, and these two go perfectly together. You're right, he said after sampling the combination. They go well together. Okay, show me your list again. She spun her notebook around so he could see the list of jobs that needed doing around Lacewing Estate, and the loose costs she'd allocated for the tasks and their timeframes. I bet I could help you jazz up the cellar door for less than that. He tapped his finger on the figures that she'd allocated for the venue makeover. You're just saying that to make me feel better, she said, nibbling the chocolate coating off the edge of her Tim Tam. It was already an ambitiously low figure, yet given their current financial restrictions, it was still more than they could afford to spend. I plan on doing a bunch of landscaping and tidying up myself, but a new fence, signage, and website will gobble up a huge chunk of that sum. You'd be surprised how much you can do yourself. His optimism was infectious, and it would have been easy to get swept up with Connor's suggestions and enthusiasm, but April had done her research. She knew shortcuts and unrealistic expectations led to either a shoddy job or disappointment, quite often both. His phone had lit up multiple times throughout the afternoon, and it did so again as she carefully folded the A3 sheet of paper they'd covered with their brainstorming ideas. I've taken up enough of your time for one day, she said, offering him another biscuit. Thanks so much for your help. I've got some great ideas to follow up with. Now that she had her long service leave approved, plus a loose budget, a timeline, an action list, and a vague plan, she felt better about the scale of work that needed to be completed. I don't mind, really, said Connor. I'd rather that than spend my whole Australian trip working inside a winery or on the couch in my rental. He stretched, and a flash of toned stomach appeared below the hem of his t-shirt. April found her eyes lingering a little longer than necessary, and startled when Mishka brushed past her in search of crumbs. She'd noticed he was a blusher, his face and neck flushing red when he got animated or embarrassed. But right now, April felt like she was the one with a hot, splotchy face. Remember what happened with Justin. She shuffled into the shade, welcoming the slight breeze. Can't complain about this weather either, he said, turning his face up to the sun streaming onto the veranda. How far's the beach from here? Beachport's my favourite, and it's only 50 minutes away, but they're all good," she said, giving him a rundown of the 3 nearest swimming spots. "There's South End, if you're after somewhere quiet, and the Winklins have holidayed at Robe as long as I've known them. Plenty of surf breaks, too." "Surfing?" He considered her question with amusement. "I've never imagined myself on a board, but—" He shrugged. "Maybe I'll give it a shot." The funny thing was, despite her earlier emphasis on professionalism, April had no trouble picturing him in bathers, a surfboard under one arm and a striped towel slung around his neck. Waxing his board, jogging into the swell, paddling after a wave. If his strong arms were any indication, it would be quite the sight. "We really, really need to get out more," she told Mishka after she waved Connor off. Connor's first week at Lacewing Estate was a stark contrast to his inaugural week at Rossvale. While Johann was happy to throw new employees into the barrel room and assess their work with alternating bouts of buoyant praise and scathing criticism, Lloyd was adamant that Connor mosey around the vineyard to get a feel for the grapevines first, then take his time acquiring himself with the vats, presses, and processes. "It feels like I'm slacking off," Connor admitted at the end of his 3rd day outside the cellar. "I'm used to hitting the ground running, not easing my way into a new job." Lloyd seemed completely bemused by Connor's proactive attitude. "No sense rushing headfirst into mistakes, I always say. There'll be plenty of time for working. First you need to understand what we do, how we do it, and most importantly, why we do it." Nodding, Connor followed Lloyd into the underground cellar, where the air was always cool, the atmosphere serene. The radio was set to a classical music channel, and Chopin's Sonata No. 3 in B minor rippled from the speakers. It was a piece Connor had learned in his teenage years, and even as he stood in the musty cellar with an empty box in his arms, his mind took him straight back to the Birmingham Music Hall, where he'd sat at a baby grand piano, wearing a suit that was a little too snug. He could vividly remember the polite applause of the crowd as he'd accepted a cash prize at the end of the event. "April teases me about wasting power on this little radio," Lloyd said, bringing him back to the present. He took a bottle of red from the bottom rack and held it up to the light, his movements unhurried. "But I like to think the wine is alive, and the music calms it down as it matures." Dust floated through the air as he wiped the label with his sleeve. With a silent nod, Lloyd put the bottle into the box Connor was holding and looked for another. "My grandfather was all about hands-on simplicity, hand-pruning vines, using a pair of Clydesdales to plough up the soil and transform the flat country into vineyards," Lloyd went on. "My dad replaced the horses with tractors and added Chardonnay and Riesling to the collection, and I've tried to keep the ball rolling by making the same great wine, removing the vines that aren't performing well and keeping the flavours consistent." "Makes a lot of sense," said Connor. "And how about the future?" It was clear Lloyd lived and breathed the winery, and although he seemed averse to risk and expansion, surely he had a vision for Lacewing Estate's future. The silence stretched out as Lloyd filled the box with 6 dusty bottles. Too deep a question for the first week, perhaps. "I'm not quite sure where the future takes us," Lloyd said eventually. "As you've seen, my daughter lives on the property but makes her income elsewhere. She's taken a different path to the one I expected, but that's her prerogative, I guess." His tone was stilted, and Connor sensed he was explaining it to himself as much as to Connor. He gestured for Connor to follow him out of the cellar and put the box on the long timber bar in the tasting room. "Hopefully one day she'll change her mind and make this her main focus. But until then, I'll keep on doing what I love and making good wine. The stables is a good project, though, I think." They both turned to the broad window that overlooked that aspect of the vineyard, complete with April's home, Kookaburra Cottage, and a smattering of ancient gum trees. Not for the first time, Connor wondered what it would be like to live on site at a vineyard, waking up every morning surrounded by the vines that had been planted, pruned, and nurtured by your ancestors. "If it were me, I'd be lining up to take the reins and put my stamp on the business." Anyway, enough of that for now. I've chosen 6 of my favourite vintages here, ones that encapsulate what we're all about at Lacewing Estate, so you can get a feel for the place. Shall we? Connor looked at the small clock beside the shelf of wine glasses. It was 2 p.m. Sorry, Lloyd, I've got piano lessons booked for later in the afternoon. Tomorrow? Lloyd nodded agreeably. Sure, tomorrow or the next day. Whenever suits you. I don't need much of an excuse to knock off early and enjoy a good drop. And although Lloyd Lacey seemed relaxed about the winery, Connor suspected he wouldn't be too thrilled about someone messing with his daughter's feelings. What was it he'd said about rushing headfirst into mistakes? Fergus was shuffling around the kitchen when Connor finished work, the fixings for a fry-up spread across the bench. You know where the fire extinguisher is, right? Connor joked, admiring his housemate's determination and persistence in the face of repeated cooking failures. Don't laugh. At least I didn't sign up to bake a bloody cake, Fergus called out cheerfully from the depths of the fridge. Oh, the cake. Connor closed his eyes. He needed to put a bit of brain power towards that, but it'd have to wait until after his piano lessons. He changed and headed to the golf club. 3 hours later, after 6 piano lessons, Connor was in dire need of a drink and something to eat. The smell of scorched eggs still lingered when he returned home. I can whip you up a batch of eggs, said Fergus, removing the fry pan from the sink where it was soaking and tackling the ingrained black grit with a steel wool scourer. And I've been thinking about this cake-making malarkey. Are they really that desperate for entries? Recalling Fran's plea, Connor slid the show program across the bench top. From the sounds of it, they need all the cakes they can get. And there's a cash prize as incentive. Fergus set aside the scourer. Well, that's it then. I'll bake a cake too. Now, how about those eggs? This'll be fine, thanks, mate, said Connor, peeling the plastic lid off a frozen curry. He slid it into the microwave and opened his laptop at the dining table, knowing he was cutting it fine if he wanted to catch his little sisters before they went to school. Happy birthday, Pipsqueak, he said, smiling at the sight of their neat braids and the crisp white shirts under their school blazers.
Aren't you going to sing me happy birthday then?
Pippin put on a mock, stern look and cupped her ear until he started singing. Nell joined in with an imaginary conductor's baton.
I got the best presents, Con. You should see the new school bag Mum and Dad got me. So much better than the god-awful St. Mary's bags. And Nellie got me the whole series of Wolf Girl books. They're Australian, you know. Heidi gave me the Harry Potter novels too.
She chatted on, with his parents chiming in for a brief hello between packing lunches. Where are you off to tonight, Pip? Nightclubs? High tea at the Shangri-La? She stuck out her tongue.
Ha ha. Mum and Dad are taking me to Pino's Pizza. And you'll never guess who's coming.
Pippin sounded breathless, and with a lag in the computer conversation, Connor couldn't tell if the flash in her eyes was mischief or glee. King Charles? You've got a boyfriend. No, I've got it. He deadpanned. You've invited Harry Styles and he's bringing all his mates with him. Pippin gave him a withering look, just as Sharon clapped her hands and reminded them they'd miss the school bus if they dilly-dallied too long.
No, it's your Phoebe. She called around last night and I invited her.
It took all of Connor's acting skills to seem nonchalant. She certainly wasn't his Phoebe. Not anymore. A million questions popped into his head, but instead he exhaled slowly. Is that right? His ex-fiancée hadn't been in touch with him for months, and now she was tagging along to his family's birthday celebrations? Without him? What the hell? Sideshow Alley was adorned with colourful show rides, from the clowns with their expressions of perpetual astonishment to the swinging chairs that fanned out at speed. It's amazing what can be achieved in show week, thought April, surveying the showgrounds. They'd been bare just a few days earlier. Now, marquees and stalls were in various stages of being erected, and a small army of volunteers in yellow high-vis vests were marching across the lawn, looking harried even though the show gates didn't officially open for another 2 hours. April pulled the Hilux up between the poultry pavilion and the produce hall, enjoying the familiar pre-event excitement.
Another magnificent haul there, April,
called Jean, who was attaching an awning to the front of her coffee van. I hope so, Jean, said April, stepping out from the ute. Are you set up for coffee yet?
For you?
The older lady gave her a grin.
Give me 5 minutes, pet.
With its polished floorboards and cloth-covered trestles, the weatherboard hall was a space April knew well, and even without a single entry or place card to tell her what went where, she sat about adorning the empty tables with the first load of her homegrown fare. Tomatoes over here, root vegetables on this one, mixed basket in this corner. She'd always preferred arriving early and setting out her entries before the 9:45 a.m. rush. Soon the numbered cards were neatly propped beside each of her entries, and all that was left on the back seat of her ute was a red Tupperware container that she'd borrowed from Fran. Not that anyone will know whose container it is, April thought, running her finger over the strip of electrical tape she'd used to cover Fran's name. She collected 2 coffees from Jean, inhaling the fresh, earthy scent.
Come by after you've given Fran her latte. I've found a great fella for you,
Jean said, putting the finishing touches on her setup.
He's a pig farmer from Tarpeena, a real lovely lad.
Balancing the coffees on top of the Tupperware, April waved a non-committal hand, hoping Jean would be flat out with customers when she returned. Jean meant well, and although April didn't want to be roped into another of her matchmaking schemes, she also didn't want to hurt the older lady's feelings. She strode through the hall before pausing at the arched doorway that divided the produce and baking sessions. The only reason April had ever previously entered this side of the hall was to admire the sky-high sponges and perfectly paired yo-yo biscuits, or to scan the bottled preserves for Lauren's handiwork, or deliver lunch to Fran, who always started show day in a flap and finished ready to collapse into a heap. April looked down at the red container, taking a breath to compose herself before walking beneath the arch. Last night's baking efforts had yielded a bench full of dirty dishes and a cake that still wobbled in the middle when she liberated it from the baking tin. She had a newfound respect for her stepmother's dedication and culinary skills. I bought you this, April said, setting a takeaway coffee cup on the table beside Fran's clipboard. And this. She set down the cake with an apologetic wince. You're an angel, said Fran, pulling out an entry ticket and sliding her ruler down the entry chart. First and only entry in a beginner's cake category. While her smile was quick, April knew that tight voice. What type is it? Fran lifted the lid, squinting at the cake. Chocolate? April shook her head with another wince. It's vanilla. Fran took a gulp of her coffee and gave a pained nod. Vanilla it is then. Thanks, love. Just leave it there and I'll pop it on the table for you. April rubbed her stepmother's shoulder. How's everything going? Did Audrey and Eileen bury the hatchet or are they still boycotting the event? With a glance at her watch and then at the sparse entries studded across the tables, Fran shook her head. No sign of them yet, but they've got an hour until entries close. I'll even let a few late entries slip through if that's what it takes to get more plates on those tables. We'll be the laughingstock of the show circuit if we have to cancel the cookery display for next year's celebrations, or the centenary the year after that. April wasn't sure how to erase the deep lines between Fran's eyebrows, and wished once again that she shared her knack for cooking. She supposed it was normal for most people to persevere when they failed, until they were able to cook enough to feed themselves at least a few square meals a day. In all her years of adulthood, she'd never aspired to fill her fridge and pantry with home-cooked food, nor compete against the region's best bakers in the annual show extravaganza. But looking at Fran, and the near-empty tables in front of them, she realised it wasn't just Fran fretting, that the show could actually crumble if they didn't get more support. You won't have to cancel, April promised. I'm going to take those cooking classes, and by this time next year, I'll have more than a burnt cake to contribute. Well, she laughed, adding a caveat. They might be bone-dry muffins, crumbling biscuits, and burnt cake, but it'll be a good effort. And I'll rope in some more contributions too, yeah? Archie will be an easy recruit, Dan too, and I'm sure I can bully Lauren into it. She saw Fran blinking furiously. Oh, April, I can't ask you to do that. Footsteps sounded on the floorboards behind them, and April turned to see Connor and Fergus both carrying plates with plastic bags over them. 2 more entries! April was impressed that in a single week, Connor had grasped how much the event meant to Fran. I know Lloyd said you'd be happy with anything, Connor started, a familiar flush creeping across his cheeks. But the cake was so bad I thought I'd warn you first. Fergus's was marginally better than mine, show-off, but we won't be offended if you'd rather they went into the bin. April bit her lip to stop the grin spreading across her face. While Connor's sank in the middle like a crater, Fergus's was distinctly volcano-shaped, with a peak on the top that was only accentuated by the lumpy icing. In terms of baking precision, they were on par with April's singed offering, but Fran brushed away tears and opened her arms to accept the entries. Thank you both, she sniffed. April caught Connor's eye. How is it possible that his quite likely inedible cake just amplified his hotness level tenfold? That was tense, Fergus said the moment they emerged from the hall. Normally people make jokes about smoke alarms and fire extinguishers and food poisoning when they see my cooking, but I thought Fran was going to kiss me. April laughed, surveying the extra stalls that had popped up in her absence. It's been a big week. She'll be so glad when this weekend's over. The entry into the showgrounds was even more congested when they exited the hall, and she hoped some of them were making a beeline for Fran's registration table. April thought of the cooking classes voucher Polly had given her for Christmas. It was time to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Walking into the show hall that afternoon to find his horrendous excuse for a cake had been sliced in half with the raw middle oozing out onto the plate was a bit like opening the message from his little sister last night and seeing a photo of Pippin in a birthday hat, blowing out the candles with one arm around his ex-fiancée, Phoebe. Connor still hadn't responded to the message, nor had he acknowledged the photo his eldest sister Heidi had sent the next day of Pippin and Nell beside a small terrarium, holding 2 tiny tortoises. Normally he replied immediately, but with the wine-tasting, baking and show hoopla, it had been easy to nurse the hurt a little longer. A snicker and a giggle from the young couple in front of him brought Connor back to the present. Lingering by the motley array of entries in the blokes section, they singled out his flop. You couldn't really blame them. His cake was comically bad. Yeesh, said the girl, quivering with laughter. I bet that guy's a bachelor. Harsh. Connor ducked his head, not quite hearing the man's comeback. There had been something about the Lacey women that had made him enter. April, with her reluctant acceptance that she was bad at baking but would do it anyway, and Fran, whose stress levels had risen as the week progressed. It's just a cake, he told himself, glad to see Lloyd's effort had won second place, despite looking a little mushy in the middle. He continued to the beginners section, browsing the entries in the cake category. Could have been worse. He turned to see April standing across the table. At least there were 3 entries in my category. Otherwise, that sad excuse for a vanilla cake would have a card next to it with my name on it. Connor tried not to grin at the square slab of coffee-coloured cake. The chunk missing from the side suggested it had put up a fight coming out of the tin. If you want to feel better, just have a look at my oozing mess over yonder. If anything, I think we've helped all these other contestants feel a bit better about themselves, he said. How'd you go in the veggies? Not bad, but the showstopper was little Archie. His bunch of herbs won a prize, and he was runner-up in the cherry tomatoes. Connor followed her to the produce section. Not bad. Come on, you've got your name plastered on prize cards up and down the aisle. In fact, if I didn't know better, I'd think you raided the veggie aisle at Foodland for these. He picked up a bunch of bright orange carrots, the feather-like greenery tufting out the top. Peter Rabbit will risk his fluffy tail for these, he marvelled, liking the way she glowed with humble pride. And these aubergines? I've no idea what you'd cook 'em in, nor would I know a thing about growing 'em, but seriously, mind blown. Although he wasn't a gardener, he could appreciate vibrant, fresh and perfectly formed produce when he saw it. I thought Jean was exaggerating at the presentation night, but there's hardly a category that you haven't got a Guernsey in. There was no doubt she could grow things. So why on earth was she spending her days digging, planting and mowing for private customers instead of growing grapes with her father? A memory of the photograph from Pippin's birthday party flashed in his mind, and he swallowed the question. Who was he to make judgments on what someone else should and shouldn't do with their life? Want to see my favourite part of the entire show? April smiled, lifting an eyebrow in question. Follow me. Connor dragged his attention from April's entries and followed her out the door, wondering what could top winning an entire room of prizes. A cacophony of noise and smells and colour greeted them as they walked out into the bright sunlight. Children bounced gleefully on an inflatable castle, horses cantered around a grassy oval, families queued for the sizzling onion-scented sausages, and the air was thick with a carnival atmosphere. That's normally the footy ground, April said, following his gaze to the horse events, and cricket in summer. But today it was a whir of ponies with plaited tails, elaborate jumps, and sharply dressed riders. They continued past the oval, April greeting most of the people she passed with a wave or quick hello, before they arrived at a small tin shed. Inside, to Connor's surprise, were a mishmash of homemade scarecrows. From the traditional straw-stuffed shirt and hat combinations to the quirky and artistic entries, it was a sight that would chase away the most maudlin of moods. "These are gold," he said, stooping down to read the names pinned to the entries. Sparkling wine baskets and corks dangled from the hat of Mary Poppins, and a green bucket hat, blood-splattered shovel and black suit made sense when he realised that Frankenfarmer was a riff on Frankenstein. But it was the smallest scarecrow that captured his heart. Wearing a red, yellow and navy jumper and a knitted scarf and beanie, the scarecrow held a red football under one arm, with matching red, yellow and navy socks pulled up to his straw-stuffed stockinged knees, and a goofy grin on his hand-painted face. In his opposite hand, a stuffed washing-up glove painted with stripes to match the rest of the uniform. The scarecrow clasped a fan flag for Adelaide Crows. "Oh, I get it," he chuckled. "The epitome of a scarecrow." "It's the biggest footy team in the state, and the kid who made it must have known it would be the perfect ploy to win votes." A lady handed them slips of paper so they could cast their vote in the People's Choice Award. Connor recognised her as the mother of one of his newest piano students, Selena. "Hey, Fiona. Tough gig choosing between these brilliant entries," he said. "They're all super. People go to a lot of effort, don't they?" Even though he'd only been there an hour or so, it was clear the show was a much-loved celebration. "They certainly do," she said. "Maybe you'll enter next year." Connor looked at April, then nodded at Fiona. "I suppose I could try, though I'm not sure I'm creative enough to top those entries." Fiona shook her head. "You're worse than Selena. It's about participating, not winning." She laughed. "Enjoy your day. And April, I hear you're doing great things with those renovations. I've held a few items aside at the shop that I think you'll like. Call past when you're in a shopping mood." "Will do, thanks Fiona," said April, waving goodbye. "A shopping mood?" asked Connor curiously. April explained that Fiona ran a second-hand shop in town. "She has a great eye. Half my furniture came from there, and I've already bought a few things for Kookaburra Cottage. Dining table, linen tablecloths, crockery. You name it, they sell it," she said. They detoured past the petting nursery, which resembled a pram parking lot with excited children, wary animals, and even warier parents. Between the kids and the lambs, ducklings, goats, and piglets, the stall was the noisiest they'd passed so far.
"Dad, can we buy a puppy?"
"Charlie, say cheese for Mummy." "No, don't bite the kitten's tail, Lizzie." Connor watched as a tiny white and grey kitten leaped from the little girl's arms. Barely breaking stride, April scooped up the runaway feline and passed it back to the distracted stall supervisor. "I bet they draw straws to see who gets that volunteering gig," Connor said, enjoying their unhurried stroll around the grounds. "Potato spirals, pulled pork burgers, or dippy dogs?" He turned to April. "My shout. I still haven't thanked you for getting me a job." They'd just finished their lunch when they spotted Archie emerging from the weatherboard hall, his face almost split in two with an ear-to-ear grin.
"I won something!"
he called, jogging across to them with a ribbon in his hand.
And did you see my scarecrow? It's the footy one.
Connor whooped. That's what I voted for, and I didn't even know it was yours. He felt the warm glow of Archie's unadulterated joy and wondered if the boy would respond the same way when he nailed his piano pieces. He hoped so. Archie and April left him in the line for hot jam donuts and headed back into the hall for another look at the produce display. Connor was 2 people from the front when he heard his name being called. "Ah, Connor Jameson, just the man I was looking for." The other people in the queue turned to watch as Geraldine Corcoran clapped Connor on the shoulder. "I've just this morning drawn your name from the raffle bucket, if you're still keen on those cooking classes." "Is this a pity prize?" he laughed. "Did you see my entry in the cookery section and then fossick around in the bucket for my sorry name?" She shook her head, the large painted wooden beads around her neck clunking. "I'm insulted," Geraldine said. "I haven't seen you cooking, but now I'll make a point to suss it out. That way," she said with a wink, "I can get an idea of what we need to work on." "Oh, there's a whole lot to work on," Connor replied, feeling his face grow pink as he listened to her outlining the lessons and the food they'd learned to cook by the end of it. She doesn't know what she's getting herself into. 8. There was a tang of salt in the air when April pulled into Beachport the following weekend. Just the sight of the mighty Southern Ocean and a lungful of brackish air had the tension in April's shoulders loosening, though she was still thinking about the renovation as she approached the Beachport jetty. She and Mishka had skipped last Sunday's beach walk due to a post-show hangover, but the rest of the week had been productive, with the B&B's battened walls transformed by smooth grey sheets of gyprock. She'd worked alongside the tradies, mixing glue, passing tools, and admiring the way the plasterboard instantly made the space feel more like a guest house than a horse shed. April stopped several times as she walked the length of the jetty, chatting with keen fishermen along the way. She found herself pausing to watch a girl and her father catch a small pinky on a hand reel. Mishka was equally fascinated by a fisherwoman's bait bucket and tackle box, so April moved on before the retriever nosed her way into trouble. Shrieks of laughter came from the shore, and she looked up to see a group of swimmers wading into the water, laughing and squirming as their bodies adjusted to the cold temperature. "Mad as a bunch of cut snakes," said another jetty stroller as she fell into step beside April. "Wouldn't catch me doing that for quids." "Not sure I'd be brave enough either," April agreed, shivering. The temperature was one thing, plus the sharks, stingrays, and seaweed, but the distance. She couldn't imagine making it out to the pontoon, let alone the end of the jetty. By the time April was back at the shore, the swimmers were on the home stretch, and when she emerged from the coffee shop, a latte warming her hands, the swimmers were peeling off wetsuits, swimming caps, and goggles, and rinsing off under the outdoor shower. April threw a tennis ball into the shallows, and Mishka bounded after it, flying into the water. As she waited for Mishka to return, a colourful beach towel caught her eye. Even with dripping wet hair, she recognised the swimmer as the chef from the golf club presentation the previous month. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Sure is, though I'm not sure it's warm enough for bathers," April admitted. The lady wrung the water from her curls and chuckled. "That's why most of us wear wetsuits. It's fine once you get moving around and makes for a great way to start the day. You never regret a swim." "You're Geraldine from the cooking school, right?" April rushed to change the subject, suspecting the start of a swimming group sales pitch ahead. "I signed up for your beginner classes yesterday. I wasn't sure the voucher would still be valid 18 months later." "I'll always honour vouchers, even if they're curling around the edges and speckled with fly poop." "Wonderful, we've got enough for a full class now," Geraldine said, reaching into a tote bag and donning a fleecy jumper. She fished a business card from her bag and handed it to April. Her fingers were icy, but her smile was warm. "What made you finally sign up for the classes then?" April told her about the show baking and her bed and breakfast. "Might be a bit of a stretch, but I'm hoping to have warm muffins on arrival. And maybe, if I can get a hang of this cooking thing, I'd love to throw together a hamper of freshly baked goodies for vineyard picnics. And I've promised my stepmum I'll enter a bunch of things in next year's show. Ah, the all-important Penwara show, right? Sounds like two fabulous reasons to arm yourself with new skills. We'll get along just fine, I can already tell, Geraldine said, bidding farewell. After another hour with her toes in the sand, watching Mishka paddle in the shallows as she mentally sorted the to-do list for her week ahead, April headed back to Penwara. Lloyd was in the vineyard when she turned into the limestone laneway. She parked at her house and walked across to see what had caught his attention in the Shiraz vines. He pointed to a mound of tiny brown balls in the grass. Wishful thinking hadn't hindered the roaming tendencies of Archie Winkland's poddy lambs, and although she'd ushered them down the laneway and back into their paddock before they'd done any damage to the vineyard last week, they'd left their own unique trail of incriminating evidence. April tried to look surprised. "More rabbits?" she asked innocently, trying to cover for her young friend's pets. "Big woolly ones, I reckon," Lloyd said. "I'll have another word to Rupert about fixing those fences. New boundary fencing isn't in our budget right now, but we don't want those sheep thinking our vines are theirs for the taking. They can't get into the freezer quick enough, that pair of troublemakers." "Dad!" She swatted him with the back of her hand. "Speaking of fences, I've had an idea for the pile of paddock rocks behind the tractor shed." The mound was mostly limestone that they'd painstakingly, back-breakingly picked from the far paddocks before planting the latest grapes, ranging from football-sized stones to boulders that could only be moved with the tractor. Lloyd straightened up and dusted his hands on his navy trousers. "You going to dig a big hole and put 'em back underground?" She pointed to the winery. "No, I'm going to build a new entryway for the winery." "You? Or a team of expensive stonemasons we can't afford?" "Well, I'm going to look into it," she said. "How hard can it be balancing a few rocks on top of one another?" She'd watched a few YouTube tutorials on dry stone wall building, and while it didn't look easy, she suspected it would be more forgiving than a hot oven and expensive ingredients. At least the rocks and her time didn't come with a price tag. Lloyd shielded his eyes against the sun, frowning at the current entrance. "What's wrong with the gates we've already got?" They both knew that wasn't a flat-out no, and April felt a little ping of glee as she shrugged. "For starters, the L started flaking off the sign last summer, and as much as I love the idea of working for Ace Wing Estate, I feel it's one of the easy things to check off the list." "Easy?" he snorted. "Have you tried constructing a rock wall before? Building that mud brick house was the beginning of the end for your mother and me, and I only continued on with the cellar door out of sheer bloody-mindedness. And because hard labour felt like a better option than drinking my way through the divorce proceedings. Ask your mother if you don't believe me," he said. "Maybe next time she calls," April replied, knowing they would have long forgotten the conversation by the time that happened. For the second time that day, she hurried to change the subject. A conversation about her nomadic mum, who'd happily relinquished parenting responsibilities in favour of travelling, was a one-way path to a grumpy Lloyd. "I heard from Connor yesterday," she went on. "He was impressed with the Chardonnay, reckons it tastes great even at this early stage." Lloyd's frown eased a little, as she'd known it would, and she hooked a thumb towards Kookaburra Cottage. "He had a good idea for the bed and breakfast too. Want to come see?" In no time, she had the front door unlocked. "I was explaining how I planned to replace the fireplace when Connor spotted the beams we'd removed to make way for the mezzanine. Instead of scouting around for an antique fireplace surround or buying a new one and making it look old, he suggested a floating mantle. They do it all the time in the UK, and when I told Gordon, he said it was pretty common in the rustic American craftsman houses too. What do you think?" Lloyd studied the chunky piece of timber dubiously. "You reckon that'll make a good display feature? Looks like it's come off the underside of the Beachport jetty." April rolled her eyes. Since Connor had mentioned it and Gordon had agreed that he could make it work structurally, she'd created a Pinterest board with similar fireplaces and floating mantles. She knew they could do it. "I don't suppose you can spare Connor for an hour or so a day." She picked up a broom and began pushing a pile of timber offcuts towards the wall, not wanting her dad to see quite how keen she was to have an extra set of arms. "Or maybe one afternoon a week, just while I'm on long service leave." Lloyd looked over from the freshly plastered walls to the portable scaffolding Gordon had set up for painting. She hadn't accepted his suggestion that she take a real holiday. And from the chalkboard full of jobs she'd propped up in the corner, it was clear she wouldn't be spending the next 7 weeks on the couch. "I'll think about it," Lloyd said eventually, throwing her a wry look that usually preceded a yes. April hugged her arms around herself, trying to contain a fist pump. "We'll have Kookaburra Cottage up and running in no time."
End of CD 3.